We begin not with cities, but with footsteps, not with walls, but with trails worn into grass and soil by repetition, not design. The city, after all, wasn't invented overnight. It grew from a quiet ache, the human urge to stay. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors wandered, following herds, chasing rainfall, avoiding frost. They didn't build cities. They remembered places, landmarks, caves, seasonal groves. They came back not because they owned anything, but because the land gave something: water, warmth, safety, maybe even a sense of rhythm. They left behind very little: ashes, stones, the faint curve of a hearth. But in those traces, there's a pattern. Even without blueprints or bricks, humans began shaping the land with meaning. Think of a clearing where a group often camped. Someone placed a stone to mark a grave. Nearby, another lit fire at the same spot every time. Paths were trampled into grass. Children knew where not to run. The space wasn't built, but it was becoming something. Not yet a city, but not just wilderness either. This, arguably, was the true beginning of urbanism. Not when we built walls, but when we stopped treating the land as blank. Modern neuroscientists have discovered something fascinating. Our brains are wired for spatial memory. The hippocampus, the part that stores memory, is closely tied to how we remember places. You can forget a phone number, but somehow remember the crooked turn just before your grandmother's house, decades later. This wiring wasn't built for cities. It was built for survival, for knowing where the fruit tree was, where the river bent shallow, where the lion's scent was strongest. But over time, it became more than just about danger or reward. It became emotional. So what happens when people start returning to the same place, again and again? They begin to assign roles to space. This is where we bury the dead. This is where we cook. This, over here, is where we tell stories. That's where the elders sit. And just like that, space becomes place. Before there was real estate, there was ritual. And before ritual, there was rhythm. Long before the first cities, long before the first farm fields, humans built something else. Temples. Yes, temples. Before towns. At Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, over 11,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers dragged multi-ton stone pillars into circular enclosures. These people didn't farm. They didn't build permanent homes. And yet they gathered here, built here, returned here. Why? Not for shelter, but perhaps for something else. Gathering, ceremony, identity, and maybe, just maybe, planning. Some researchers believe sites like Göbekli Tepe were seasonal ritual centers. People would come from surrounding regions, stay for weeks or months, and then leave again. The site became a focal point, a marker, a prototype of centrality. Which begs the question, is the city first a place of work or a place of worship? What if our first cities were temples that grew houses around them? Territory is older than writing, maybe even older than speech. Watch any animal and you'll see the roots of it. A wolf marking a tree, a bird singing on a branch that marks its edge, a herd following the same grazing pattern year after year. Humans did the same, but with one key difference: they remembered, and they retold. Over there, that's where the hunters drowned crossing the flood. We don't go there. This circle of stones, that's our great-grandmother's resting place. Boundaries weren't just drawn, they were told. And eventually, sung, carved, marked. Some of the earliest art is not art at all. It's geometry, lines, circles, borders. And what do you get when you put enough remembered borders together? A plan. Of course, the body needs more than memory. It needs shelter. And shelter, if you're smart, is reused. Imagine it. A group finds a natural cave near a water source. It's dry. It echoes in a comforting way. There's enough game nearby to feed the group. They sleep there once. They sleep there again. Someone stacks stones to block the wind. Another arranges the firewood more neatly. And someone else says, "Why go anywhere else?" The first permanent dwellings weren't designed. They were defaulted. Çatalhöyük, often cited as the world's first true town, had no streets. Homes were built right up against one another. People walked on rooftops. Ladders led inside. It wasn't elegant, but it was safe, efficient. The beginning of communal density. And what does density need? Rules. If you build too close to someone else's hearth, you'll smoke them out. If your ladder blocks their sunlight, they'll complain. Suddenly, the first zoning laws are born, not from paper, but from friction. And that friction, that's planning in its rawest form. Now let's shift our attention to something subtle, something that most people overlook when they think about ancient settlement, weather patterns. It's easy to romanticize early urban life as just a natural outgrowth of agriculture or belief. But in truth, it was a battle against the elements. Wind, heat, dust, rainfall. All of these shaped the orientation of the earliest dwellings. Doors faced away from prevailing winds. Walls were thick, not because it was fashionable, but because insulation meant survival. And when a group of homes faced the same direction, that wasn't coincidence. That was the seed of uniformity. Uniformity leads to predictability. And predictability, that's the soil real planning grows in. Let's not gloss over the real material beneath the city. Earth, not stone, not marble, just dirt. In early settlements, mud was everything. You slept on it. You shaped it. You packed it into bricks. A handful of mud, dried in the sun, was the primary building material of humanity for thousands of years. Why? Because it was everywhere. And it was forgiving. If a wall fell down, you didn't need a quarry. You just added water and started again. But mud had limits, especially when it came to water. And that's when early humans began their most important work, figuring out how to move water without moving homes. Irrigation came first, then channels, then gutters, then public cisterns. Before there was a city, there was a drainage ditch, and it took no time at all before someone was appointed, officially or otherwise, to look after it. So now you have mud homes, communal wells, shared streets, and someone with a sense of responsibility. Sound familiar? It's not just a settlement anymore. It's a proto-city. Every permanent community eventually divides labor. Some plant, some building, some gather, some teach, and then some remember. The keepers of memory were the first planners, not because they sat at a desk with diagrams, but because they knew which floodplain would drown you and which path had safe footing in spring. They didn't wear badges, but their authority was real. It came from knowledge. In time, memory became record. Records became marks, carvings, symbols, proto-writing. And suddenly, space wasn't just organized, it was documented. You know what that leads to? Accountability. And accountability is the foundation of ownership. We often assume the idea of property began with agriculture. You plant a seed, you watch it grow, and you don't want someone else taking it. And that's true, to a point. But property likely began with proximity. Let's say your family always camps on the same side of a stream. You sleep in the same spot. You stash firewood there. You keep stones in a pattern your kids recognize. Another group arrives and sets up just downstream, a little too close. Their dogs bark at your children. Their smoke drifts your way. And now you're talking. You say, "We always camp here." They say, "So what?" And now you have a dispute. Disputes lead to negotiation. Negotiation leads to rules. Rules lead to permanence. Permanence leads to real estate. Even before land had price, it had priority. And that priority, in some early cultures, was enforced not by law, but by story. This hill belongs to us because our ancestor died here. This grove is ours because we buried our dreams beneath it. These weren't metaphors, they were claims, emotional, binding, sometimes sacred. The first real estate wasn't bought. It was earned through memory. Let's revisit Göbekli Tepe for a moment. Why did a society with no known agriculture or permanent dwellings build such an elaborate site? Why drag pillars taller than a man into perfect circles? Some archaeologists believe it was the building of the temple itself that caused people to stay. That ritual preceded agriculture. That belief created the need for bread, not the other way around. It's a radical idea, but it fits. People gathered to worship, and in doing so, needed food. So they planted. And if you're planting, you can't leave. And if you can't leave, you build shelter. And if you build shelter, well, you know where this ends. What we call planning might have started as spiritual logistics. Where should the altar go? Where should the people sit? How will they see the sky? Even today, modern cities reserve the best views for monuments, not malls. The sacred shapes the spatial. Always has. There's something else that gets forgotten in the history of early cities. Women. Most ancient architecture was not monumental. It was domestic. And domestic space, kitchens, courtyards, hearths, was designed, maintained, and adapted by women. We rarely have their names, but we have their fingerprints, literally, on pottery, on bricks, in walls smoothed by hand. Early city layout wasn't just shaped by defense or trade. It was shaped by needs like, where will the baby sleep? How do we reach water safely? Where do we put the grain where the goats won't find it? The spatial logic of domesticity laid the grid before the grid, and maybe it's time we remembered that. One of the earliest signs that a settlement is turning into something bigger, into a true proto-city, is what happens between the homes. Not the buildings themselves, but the paths, thresholds, and gathering spaces. When do you first need a path? When someone you don't live with wants to reach your door. When do you build a courtyard? When 3 homes need to share light, tools, or gossip. When do you get noise complaints? When proximity becomes expectation. Even without formal roads or city councils, early humans began planning the flow of traffic, human, animal, and sometimes spiritual. In Çatalhöyük, they walked on rooftops. That was the traffic system, completely above ground, with no alleyways below. But even that required a logic, a collective understanding. This roof is yours, that one is mine, and here's where the public walks. And this concept, that the space between things also needs planning, is maybe the first seed of urban design as a distinct concept. Because a city is not just a pile of homes, it's the choreography of how those homes speak to each other. Picture an early village, maybe 20 families. Each group builds their shelter with whatever materials they have: wood, mud, straw, woven grass. At first, things are improvised. One hut here, another a few paces away. But then the problems begin. Someone's waste flows towards someone else's cooking spot. A neighbor builds too close to your drying yard. Kids get sick because there's no clean route between water and home. Suddenly, the village has an incentive to think ahead. Where do we dump waste? Where do we put livestock? Where can we put the well so it's accessible but protected? These decisions don't happen in a single meeting. They evolve, but over time, they harden into patterns, and patterns become culture. That's the earliest form of an urban code. And eventually, someone steps up and says, next time we build a house, it goes here, not there. There's your first city planner. Many of the world's earliest settlements show evidence of geometric logic, but not always with rulers. Humans have an instinct for symmetry. Children draw with central points. Villagers organize tents around a fire. Graves are aligned with stars, rivers, or sunrise. We may not have had math, but we had meaning, and meaning organizes space. At Nabta Playa, in Egypt's western desert, people built stone circles aligned with the summer solstice over 7,000 years ago. In Britain, similar patterns emerged with early henges. None of this was random. These were societies beginning to impose order on chaos, not just with tools, but with intention. That intention is the DNA of city planning. And the moment someone said, the houses should face east, or we'll place the shrine at the center, something ancient clicked into place. The city as cosmos, a mirror of the world as it ought to be. Let's talk about the true shaper of early cities, agriculture. It's easy to assume that cities grew because of clever engineers or ambitious rulers. But no, cities grew because grain needed to be stored. That's it. The second someone harvested more than they could eat in a day, they needed a safe place to keep it. That place had to be dry, elevated, guarded, and known. Once you have a granary, you need someone to guard it, someone to record what's in it, someone to distribute it. Suddenly, you've got roles, and roles demand proximity. People gather near the food. Food becomes power. Power becomes architecture. And architecture becomes policy. Where the grain goes, the city follows. And where there's food, there's trade. People don't just store, they exchange. I have barley, you have fish. Let's meet in the middle. That middle becomes a market, and the market becomes a town square, a heartbeat, a ritual. And eventually, someone builds a wall around it. Let's pause here. Why build walls? It's easy to say, for defense. And yes, walls keep out threats. But in many early settlements, the walls weren't thick enough to stop an army. They were there to say, this is us, inside, our laws, our gods, our way of life. Outside, uncertainty, wilderness, danger. The wall is symbolic before it's strategic. It's a membrane, a filter. It says, we are different from what surrounds us. And once that line is drawn, everything inside becomes curated. Suddenly, the layout matters more. You've got limited space, Homes can't just sprout randomly. You need efficiency. You need clarity. You need a plan. So maybe it starts small, a simple grid, or maybe radial streets from a central well. Maybe it follows the river or traces the hills. The important part is this: it's no longer just survival, it's design. And design means someone is thinking ahead. That's not a camp anymore. That's a city. Here's something people rarely think about when imagining the first cities: sound. The noise of a city tells you what kind of place it is. Today, we hear sirens, engines, chatter, the hum of electricity. But what did early cities sound like? Clay pots clinking together in a shared courtyard, wooden pestles pounding grain in rhythm, voices calling across rooftops, dogs barking in alleyways, a drum marking the beginning of a ritual, children laughing or wailing somewhere off down a narrow path. And that noise, it carried. Walls were close, roofs echoed, people were always in earshot of one another, which meant something important for planning. Privacy didn't exist until it had to be invented. That might sound strange, but it's true. Planning for privacy, walls thick enough to muffle, distances long enough to breathe, wasn't natural. It was reactive. And that's another moment where urban planning emerged. In response to how people felt, not just what they needed. The city began to accommodate not just bodies, but moods. Fire is both the creator and the destroyer of cities. In early settlements, fire was essential for cooking, for warmth, for light, for rituals. But it was also unpredictable. A single wind gust, a dry season, a spark, and half the settlement was gone. That's why some of the earliest recorded urban regulations were about fire spacing. In some Neolithic settlements, hearths were required to be built a certain distance from walls. In others, communal fires were encouraged to reduce the number of independent flames. Ash pits had to be placed in specific locations. Roof materials were chosen for their flame resistance when they could be. And eventually, someone drew a rule. Written or not, that rule needed enforcement, and enforcement meant authority. Fire management, in a strange way, may have been the first municipal service. Today, we have fire codes. Then, they had taboos, passed down warnings, spatial customs. All of it was city planning before the name existed. Imagine two neighbors in a small early city. One raises chickens, the other dyes wool. At first, they get along fine, but after a while, the chicken droppings attract flies. The dyeing process stinks. Arguments erupt. Someone suggests maybe the workshops should go on the other side of the settlement, away from homes, closer to the stream. There it is, the first zoning decision. It wasn't about aesthetics or economy. It was about quality of life. And once people realized that placing certain functions apart from others made life smoother, zoning stuck around. But here's the funny thing. It's never been simple. Even 5,000 years ago, people argued, why can't I bake bread in my home? Why do the potters get the south side of the wall? Why should we move the animal pens when they've always been there? And that's the point. Planning has always been a conversation, sometimes a loud one. Zoning isn't a modern invention. It's a human instinct, a way of separating function and flow, risk and reward, noise and silence. And the moment a society agreed, explicitly or implicitly, that this belongs here and that belongs over there. They weren't just building a town. They were building policy into geography. Let's switch to something poetic, something strangely modern for such ancient times. The idea that the earth itself could record information. Before paper, before writing, people used the ground to document ownership, memory, and law. They dug trenches to mark territory. They placed stones, sometimes carved, sometimes blank, as signposts. They planted trees not for fruit, but for proof. This is the corner of my land. Even today, in parts of Africa and Asia, land borders are remembered not by deed, but by oral testimony and landscape features, from the big tree to the red rock to where the two rivers meet. But even this primitive mapping was a kind of registration. You didn't need parchment. You needed witnesses. The elders remembered. The neighbors confirmed. Planning and record-keeping were fused together, not in ink, but in community memory. And while this kind of system might seem fragile to us today, it was also human, adaptable, responsive, and deeply intertwined with trust. When trust broke down, you needed something more permanent. Enter writing. When we talk about the invention of writing, we often think of stories, poems, or royal decrees. But that's not what writing was originally for. Writing, in its first form, was accounting. It was urban, bureaucratic, satisfyingly dull. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded how much barley had been delivered, how many goats were traded, who owed what, and when. But more than anything else, they documented land. The word cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped, named for the stylus that pressed little triangular marks into clay. Thousands of these tablets survive, and a staggering number deal with land. Boundaries, leases, disputes, gifts, inheritances. This was planning, but bureaucratized. It was no longer enough to say, "I've always planted here." Now you had to prove it, with a mark, a witness, and maybe a seal. This changed everything, because once land could be recorded, it could also be transferred, bought, sold, lent, rented, collateralized. And when land becomes an object of trade, the city becomes more than a home. It becomes a market. Cities were no longer just spatial. They were transactional. In early Mesopotamian cities like Uruk, Nippur, and Lagash, contracts were everything. And while the kings and priests may have wielded the power, it was the scribes who kept the wheels turning. Scribes were city planners in their own right, not because they laid out roads, but because they defined space in law. Their tablets described the exact location of a field relative to a canal, the type of crop allowed to be grown, how many donkeys could pass through a neighbor's gate, what would happen if a wall collapsed onto someone else's land. This wasn't just record-keeping. This was spatial regulation. And it wasn't theoretical. You could be fined, jailed, even exiled for violating these terms. The scribe's pen, or stylus rather, was the boundary stone of the new world. But legalism wasn't the only way people remembered land. In many cultures, especially those without formal writing systems, land was passed down through stories. My grandfather built the orchard next to the hill where the three hawks nest. Our family well is under the tree that never flowers. The path that leads to the spirit stone, that's where our grazing ends. These weren't vague tales. They were geographical memory systems. In some indigenous societies, songs acted like maps. Entire landscapes were encoded into rhythm, melody, and verse. A person could sing their way through the territory, each verse a landmark, each pause a turn. Planning? Yes, just not in lines and diagrams, but in sound. And perhaps this reminds us, not all cities begin with bricks. Some begin with belonging. There's a strange kind of magic in an invisible boundary, when everyone respects it, but no one can see it. In early communities, long before fences or deeds, there were paths you simply didn't cross, not because of a written law, but because of shared understanding. That mound, sacred. That tree, off limits. That stretch of land. Everyone knew it belonged to the family with the twisted walk son and the singing goats. And if someone crossed it, you didn't call a lawyer. You called a meeting, or a shaman, or sometimes you started a feud that outlived both sides. Because land wasn't just survival, it was identity. A mistake on the ground could echo for generations. We like to think of cities as physical things, walls, roads, rooftops, but so much of what made a city work was unseen. Rules, expectations, myths, agreements. The early city was 50% mudbrick and 50% belief. In time, those beliefs took on form. In Mesopotamia, boundary stones, called kuduru, were inscribed with curses, literal curses. This land belongs to X. If you move this stone, may the gods smite your cattle, rot your fields, blind your heirs. These weren't empty threats. People took them seriously. The stone wasn't just a marker. It was a witness, a presence, a contractual ghost. In ancient Egypt, property boundaries were marked and remarked annually after the Nile flood. Entire teams of royal surveyors would go out, rods in hand, to redraw land claims that had washed away. And every redraw was a chance for conflict, which means every redraw also meant planning, regulation, mediation. You see, even when nature erased the lines, people put them right back, because by this point, the map lived in the mind as much as in the mud. Once a city reached this level of complexity, witnessed boundaries, interfamily deals, shared access rules, it had crossed a line. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a network of obligations. And that's what a modern city still is. Let's zoom out for a moment. It's tempting to look at ancient city plans, those early maps carved on stone or modeled in baked clay, and think, wow, they really figured it out. But those diagrams came after the living thing. The map was never the starting point. It was the autopsy. Real cities grew like organisms. They inhaled trade, exhaled waste, developed nerves in the form of paths, bones in the form of temples, skin in the form of walls. Every now and then, someone tried to impose symmetry, a perfect square, a radial plaza, a sacred axis, but cities always pushed back. No matter how tight the plan, the people found new ways to bend it. A shortcut across the field, a market stall on the side of the road, a shrine in a drainage ditch. The earliest lesson in city planning wasn't how to impose order. It was how to dance with entropy. And that lesson has never changed. So here we are. We've traced the journey from wandering to settling, from memory to measurement, from ritual fire to zoning squabbles. And every step of the way, humans have asked the same quiet question: where do we go? Where do we place the fire, the tent, the temple, Where do we bury the dead, and will they stay buried? Where does my world end, and yours begin? And out of those questions came decisions, and out of those decisions came patterns, and from those patterns cities were born, not suddenly, not cleanly, but undeniably. Before there were rulers or armies or architects, there were people with needs and people with opinions, and from that friction came something extraordinary, a shared shape to life, not just a place to be, but a place to become. They didn't call them cities, not at first. They didn't need to. There wasn't a word for urban, because there wasn't anything else to compare it to. What they had was land, food, shelter, and time. And with time came layers. At first, just practical ones, layer upon layer of packed earth, broken pottery, the ash of last season's fires. Then spiritual ones, altars, burials, memory. Then the physical, walls built on old walls, homes above old homes, doorways shifting slightly each generation to better catch the breeze or avoid the scent of waste. The first cities were less like blueprints and more like compost heaps of intention. Every generation added something, removed something else, left a trace, until one day, perhaps without realizing it, the villagers looked around and saw a city. Let's begin with Jericho, often called the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Tucked near the Jordan River, Jericho sprang to life over 11,000 years ago. Think about that. We're closer in time to Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to Jericho's first wall. And yes, it had a wall, one of the earliest ever discovered. Not some makeshift palisade, but a real structure, wide, circular, 3.6 meters thick at the base. Why build a wall so early? Some say for defense, others for flood control. But the truth is murky. What's clear is this: someone decided that space needed definition, and once defined, it became permanent. The homes of Jericho were round, courtyards small, but the layout suggests planning. Roads, not random paths, storage areas, communal, not just private, and perhaps most interestingly, plaster skulls. Yes, human skulls, buried beneath homes, then dug up, covered in plaster, and painted with eyes. What does that tell us? That city planning wasn't just physical, it was ancestral. The dead weren't moved aside, they were incorporated, remembered, lived with. This wasn't just shelter, it was lineage made visible. And when your ancestors are literally under your floor, you think twice about where to build your next room. If Jericho gave us the wall, Çatalhöyük gave us something stranger, a city with no streets. Located in modern-day Turkey, Çatalhöyük thrived between 7,500 and 5,700 BCE. It had hundreds of tightly packed homes, but you entered from above. There were no alleys or courtyards at ground level. People climbed down through holes in the roofs. The rooftops were streets. Sounds odd, right? But it worked. And more than that, it shaped how people related to each other. Your neighbor wasn't beside you. They were above you, or below. Homes were connected like a hive. Movement was vertical, and that affected planning deeply. There were shared ovens, shared workspaces, shared shrines, and remarkably, a relative equality in home size and ornamentation. This wasn't a city built on hierarchy. It was built on proximity and ritual. Many homes had shrines, bull horns embedded in walls, wall paintings, statues of fat goddesses. Death wasn't hidden. Burials happened inside the home, under sleeping platforms. Imagine that for a second. You're a child growing up in Çatalhöyük. You sleep above your grandmother's bones. You walk on your neighbor's roof. You paint sacred images on your wall, next to your drying meat. It's a city, but it doesn't feel like one in our modern sense. No palaces, no temples, no markets. And yet, everything was intentional. The orientation of rooms, the placement of ovens, the direction of doorways. That's planning. Not from a top-down ruler, but from a bottom-up culture. A shared rhythm of life that dictated shape. Now let's drift south, into the baked plains of southern Mesopotamia, where city dust still clings to the bones of the desert. Eridu. To most, it's a name barely whispered in textbooks. But in the Sumerian imagination, it wasn't just a city, it was the first city. Kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, they wrote. Not metaphorically, literally. The gods picked Eridu, chose it, planted it in the world like a divine thumbtack, and from that anchor, urban life spread. So what was it like? Built around 5,400 BCE, Eridu didn't start as a metropolis. It began with a temple, not a market, not a fortress, a temple. That's important. Religion wasn't something that grew alongside the city. It was the seed from which the city grew. Each time the temple was rebuilt, and it happened dozens of times, they built it on top of the old one, higher, closer to the heavens, more imposing, a kind of sacred sediment. And around that center, homes, workshops, paths, people. This was the first time a city rose, not just for shelter or trade, but to serve a cosmic order. Planning here wasn't about function, it was about symbol. Where do you place the granary? Wherever the temple shadow falls. Where should the priest live? Near the gate of the gods. What about the poor? Wherever they won't disrupt the ritual processions. The city had a moral geography, and that concept, planning a place not just for what it does, but for what it means, would echo across every civilization to come. Then came Uruk. Oh, Uruk. If Eridu was the whispered prayer, Uruk was the full sermon, the first truly bustling, teeming, scribbled-over city, a place with traffic, arguments, debt, poetry, taxes, clay tablets, and proper streets. By 3000 BCE, Uruk may have held over 40,000 people, more than many medieval European towns. And it wasn't just the size, it was the structure. Uruk had districts, specialized areas, for pottery, for temples, for scribes, for residential clusters. It had walls, gigantic ones, stretching for miles. It had a king, Gilgamesh, if the legends are to be believed, and it had writing, lots of it. Most of those early clay tablets weren't for literature. They were urban paperwork. Who owed whom grain? What was stored in the warehouse? How many bricks were used to repair the canal? This wasn't some free-form sprawl. This was managed space. You can almost hear the complaints. Why can't we build near the ziggurat anymore? The canal is overflowing again. Who's in charge of dredging it? Urban life had arrived in full, and with it came everything we still associate with cities: traffic, noise, bureaucracy, taxes, identity, tension, and perhaps the most important development of all, surplus. Because once a city had enough food to feed people who didn't farm, it could sustain specialists, builders, record keepers, priests, planners. That's when the city becomes more than shelter. It becomes a system. And then, something remarkable. thousands of miles east of Uruk, along the slow-breathing floodplains of the Indus River, rose a city that still baffles archaeologists. Mohenjo-Daro, built around 2500 BCE, it didn't look like Eridu, or Uruk, or anything else in Mesopotamia or Egypt. There was no grand temple at the center, no palaces, no lavish tombs, no ziggurats reaching for heaven, or pyramids piercing the sky. And yet, in terms of planning, Mohenjo-Daro was light years ahead. The streets were straight, laid out on a grid, intersecting at right angles, paved with bricks, standardized bricks. Let that sink in. In 2500 BCE, these people had a building code. Every brick was the same size, in a consistent ratio of 1 to 2 to 4. If that sounds boring, it's not. It means that someone, somewhere, enforced uniformity across a sprawling city that likely held 30,000 to 50,000 people. It had a drainage system that wouldn't embarrass a modern suburb, covered sewers, public baths, reservoirs, private wells. This wasn't just planning, it was maintenance planning. Someone thought beyond building, they thought about after. What happens when it rains? Where the waste will go? How people will move from home to market, to workshop, to rest? And yet, no king, no monumental inscriptions, no conquest narratives carved in stone, just quiet, anonymous efficiency. Who were these planners? We don't know. Their script hasn't been deciphered, but their hands are everywhere, in the slope of a drain, the curve of a stairwell, the logic of a neighborhood. And Mohenjo-Daro wasn't alone. Its sister city, Harappa, followed the same plan. So did Lothal, Kalibangan, and dozens of others. The Indus cities weren't chaotic expansions. They were civil engineering marvels. And perhaps the most amazing part? The houses of the elite weren't vastly different from the common homes. Public facilities, baths, wells were accessible. There was a strong sense of civic parity. Not equality in the modern political sense, but something rare in the ancient world, urban dignity. And all of this, planned, intentionally, elegantly, without ego, a miracle in baked brick. There's a lesson here that cuts deep. When we think of ancient cities, we often imagine grandeur, temples, tombs, statues. But Mohenjo-Daro reminds us, planning is often invisible. The smooth road, the working drain, the market that just makes sense to navigate. That's planning. That's brilliance. But because it doesn't shout, it often gets forgotten. And yet, it's in these quieter cities that we see the true heart of early urbanism. Not in the monuments, but in the movement. Not in what was built to impress, but in what was built to function. In the dusty lowlands along the Yellow River, the dawn of Chinese civilization began not with fire or conquest, but with a quiet alignment to the stars. The early Tu culture, emerging around 1900 BCE, gave us some of China's first known planned cities. These weren't haphazard clusters of huts. They were axial, intentional, cosmological. At early Tu, archaeologists uncovered a walled palace city with roads running in cardinal directions. Inside the walls, residential quarters, bronze workshops, and evidence of carefully staged ritual spaces. Not just, this is where people lived, but this is how people were meant to move. And movement, in ancient China, wasn't just about logistics. It was about order, harmony, the placement of doors, gates, roads, even drains, reflected beliefs about balance, hierarchy, and heaven's mandate. Enter Anyang, capital of the Shang dynasty around 1300 BCE, bigger, more complex, and unmistakably planned. Here we see grid layouts combined with sacred geography. The city wasn't a sprawl, it was stratified. The central zone, royal palaces, and ancestral temples. Around them, elite homes. Beyond that, common dwellings, workshops, and kilns. Farther still, the tombs, elaborate subterranean worlds for the dead. The city was a mirror of the cosmos, with the living at the center and the ancestors watching from the margins. And everywhere, ritual, oracles carved into bones, massive bronze cauldrons, aligned courtyards, and roads that bent, not for topography, but for symbolism. It was the architecture of meaning. The Chinese word for city, cheng, originally referred to a wall, but it wasn't just protection. It was a container of cosmic order. The early Chinese city was an argument, etched into soil and stone, that harmony could be built, maintained, and enforced. Planning wasn't just administrative, it was moral. Even in growing capitals like Luoyang or Yin, there was restraint. Streets were broad, markets were organized, water infrastructure was intelligent, and the rhythm of life, closely observed. The city worked on a clock made of rituals. At dawn, gates opened. At dusk, they closed. Bells rang to mark transitions. Sounds controlled time, and time controlled space. Planning here wasn't just spatial, it was temporal. Imagine it. Your movements dictated not by convenience, but by ceremony. You walked when the gate opened. You stayed in when the drums signaled night. And through that rhythm, the city breathed. It's a kind of urban choreography that modern planners often overlook. But in ancient China, it was central. Space, sound, time, inseparable. Let's turn now to Africa, where some of the world's oldest and least understood cities unfolded, not with geometry and empire, but with rhythm, ritual, and community. Start with Gene Geno in present-day Mali. Occupied as early as 250 BCE, it sat along the Niger River and thrived for more than 1,000 years. But this wasn't a city with kings and palaces. There were no vast roads leading to temples, no towering statues of warlords. And yet, it was a city, a dense, circular layout, mudbrick homes, street patterns like river deltas, natural, braided, dynamic. No zoning board, no general's order, and still, it worked. The city's growth resembled a conversation, not a command. Archaeologists found no central authority, but complex trade networks, metallurgy, and urban density that suggest high-level cooperation. How did they plan it? Likely through custom, through elders and artisans, who passed knowledge not by writing it, but by doing it. You learned where to build by how the light hit the street at dusk. You shaped your walls by what the rains did last year. The planning wasn't written on papyrus, it was embodied. Now move farther south, to the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe. Here, between the 11th and 15th centuries CE, rose massive granite structures, built without mortar, some towering over 11 meters high. And here's the thing, no straight streets, no grid, no symmetry, yet the city functioned, flourished even. It was a trade hub, a spiritual center, a royal residence, but also a mosaic of movement. Passageways twisted through stone enclosures. Visibility was controlled. Some spaces narrowed deliberately, forcing humility. Others widened, inviting awe. This was planning through experience, not how do we organize people, but how should they feel as they move. Imagine a planner today proposing that idea. Let's design this street so it feels sacred, not efficient. That's what Great Zimbabwe did. They sculpted stone like emotion, and in that, they revealed a deeper truth. Cities aren't machines. They're rituals in space. Cross the Atlantic. We're in the Americas now, standing on the Avenue of the Dead. This is Teotihuacan in central Mexico. At its height around 500 CE, it was the sixth largest city in the world, perhaps home to 125,000 people. And it wasn't chaos. It was planned, rigorously. The Avenue of the Dead runs for nearly 2 miles, perfectly straight. It connects massive pyramids, the Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Sun, and flanks temples, platforms, plazas. The entire city was laid out on a grid, oriented by astronomical points. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about cosmic function. Homes, modest and elite alike, were built into multi-family compounds. They had drainage, ventilation. Some had murals, altars, even private shrines. And these weren't just decorations. They were calendars in paint, maps of time, blueprints of belief. Urban planning here served a mythic order. You didn't just live in a neighborhood. You lived in a cosmological quadrant. Your dwelling echoed a divine structure. And yet, Teotihuacan was diverse. Archaeological digs show ethnic districts, Oaxacan quarters, Gulf Coast styles, Maya influence. In other words, it was a multi-ethnic metropolis, managed without iron-fisted rule. The city's bones, its roads, walls, compounds, held people together when politics might not. That's not just urban design. That's civic resilience. Even older than Teotihuacan is Caral in Peru. Dating back to 2600 BCE, it rivals Mesopotamia and Egypt in age and offers something completely unique. In Caral, you find pyramids, not for burial, but for ceremony, and not military, not imperial, but musical, flutes, horns, amphitheaters with perfect acoustic engineering. Urbanism here wasn't about conquest. It was about resonance. The city layout emphasized gathering, circular plazas, broad steps, gentle gradients, pathways curved, not for defense, but to guide movement gracefully. There's evidence of irrigation, textile workshops, even trade with distant coastal regions. But what's most notable? No signs of war, no weapons, no fortifications, no burned layers. This was a city that planned for connection, not domination. It reminds us, the first question a planner must ask isn't, what do we protect, but what do we want to preserve? Let's begin on the island of Crete, in the shining days of the Minoan civilization. Long before Athens and Sparta, there was Knossos, a palace complex that was, in truth, a city in disguise. It's said that Knossos was the home of the labyrinth, of the Minotaur, of corridors twisting endlessly, doors opening into doors, staircases that rise then fall, light wells and painted columns that seem to breathe with the wind. And whether or not the myth was true, the metaphor was real. Knossos was a labyrinth, not of confusion, but of intentional complexity. This wasn't some fortress or citadel. There were no walls, no battlements. Instead, open courts, fresco-covered halls, storage rooms big enough to feed a kingdom, and plumbing, yes, plumbing, so advanced that modern engineers are still impressed. Rainwater was collected, funneled, reused. Waste was carried away in terracotta pipes. Ventilation cooled the rooms. And more than that, the layout shaped experience. Walk through Knossos, and you don't feel directed. You feel drawn, pulled inward. Rooms unfold like a story. There's no singular center, just a rhythm of space and light. That's planning at its most poetic. The city wasn't ruled by fear or grid or height. It was ruled by fluidity, by color, by memory. It said that Minoan architects designed for experience, not control. You were supposed to get lost, not in confusion, but in feeling. Planning here wasn't geometry, it was gesture. Then came Athens. If Knossos was the city of dreams, Athens was the city of ideas, and it changed everything. By the 5th century BCE, Athens had become not just a city, but a stage for philosophy, democracy, and the public life. And with that shift came a new kind of planning. At its center was the agora, a marketplace, yes, but also a gathering space. Debate happened here. Laws were shouted here. Philosophers wandered here. The agora wasn't beautiful. It was functional, but it was also symbolic. The city belonged to its people. This changed how space was designed. Now, streets weren't just for processions. They were for dialogue. Public buildings weren't just temples. They were tools for participation. And homes, modest, cramped, often overshadowed by the grandeur of civic structures. Athens didn't plan for equality, but it planned for visibility. You saw the Acropolis. You heard the assembly. You felt the weight of public voice in stone. And as Greek colonies spread, this model spread too. A grid where possible, a fortified Acropolis, a central agora, a sense that a city should reflect the order of the mind. Planning wasn't just about traffic or sanitation, it was about politics. You don't put a temple at the end of a street by accident. You do it to suggest that divinity concludes the journey. You don't curve a path just to fit the terrain. You curve it to delay the reveal, to make beauty last longer. This was planning as rhetoric, as persuasion, and it would reach its peak in the work of one man. Enter Hippodamus of Miletus, the so-called father of urban planning. In the 5th century BCE, he proposed cities that were neat, rational, geometric. 3 classes of people, 3 parts to the city, all aligned on a tidy grid. To Hippodamus, beauty was symmetry. Justice was order. If the city could be carved into squares, maybe life itself could become understandable. His ideas took root in the planning of Piraeus, the Athenian port, and later Alexandria, perhaps the most famously planned city of the ancient world. The Hippodamian grid wasn't soft, it wasn't spiritual, it was mathematical, and in many ways it worked. Straight roads, efficient traffic, clear zoning, predictable growth. But it also introduced something new, a city that could be replicated, copied, franchised, and that, more than anything else, changed how the world thought about cities. No longer unique expressions of culture and soil, cities could now be templates. Planning had become a system. Let's be clear, Rome didn't invent the grid, but they perfected its weaponization. If Greek cities were poems, Roman cities were manuals, blueprints with spears. By the time of the Republic, and especially during the Empire, Rome had a system for founding cities, and they weren't just cities, they were tools. Everywhere the legions marched, they left something behind, a fort that became a camp, that became a town, that became a city, and every time, the same plan. Two major roads, Cardo, north-south, and Decumanus, east-west, a central forum where they crossed, blocks, insulae, carved into predictable shapes, a perimeter wall with gates, a grid as neat as a chessboard. This was the Roman stamp, and they slammed it down from Britain to Syria, Gaul to North Africa. You know what that means. Planning was no longer just about how a city functioned. It was about how a city signaled allegiance. To live in a Roman-planned city meant you paid taxes to Rome, you walked Roman streets, you followed Roman law, you were part of the order. The Forum wasn't just a marketplace, it was a symbol of Roman control. The baths weren't just for cleanliness, they were for unity. The amphitheater wasn't just entertainment, it was a civic pacifier. The city itself became a propaganda tool. And here's the twist. Romans were also real estate developers. The moment the lines were drawn and the streets paved, land gained value. New cities attracted settlers. Settlers brought money. Money brought villas. Villas brought speculation. Soon, Roman elites were investing in land, not for use, but for potential. Sound familiar? Real estate was being born, not just as ownership of land, but as ownership of expectation. And the more people moved into cities, the more they needed infrastructure. Romans delivered. Aqueducts that carried water for miles, sewers like the Cloaca Maxima, public toilets, multi-story apartment blocks, insulae, strict building regulations. Well, sometimes. The city wasn't just a place, it was a machine. It fed, it drained, it heated, it cooled, it policed, and it lasted. Even today, in places like Cologne, London, Lyon, and Barcelona, you can walk streets that still follow the Roman plan, because that's what planning can do when done with force, consistency, and concrete. Roman cities were portable civilization, and they left behind not just ruins, but habits, ways of thinking about space, hierarchy, distance, and access. Let's strip the map bare for a moment. Forget the aerial view. Forget diagrams. Forget the planner's desk. Now imagine the city from the ground up. You're not designing a city. You're walking through one. Your feet slap against packed earth or sun-warmed stone. You navigate corners you didn't draw. You pause in a shaded alley. You smell bread. You hear a goat. You turn. This is how the ancient city lived, not as theory, but as rhythm. And from this rhythm, patterns emerged, predictable ones, where people stopped, others gathered, where sun hit a wall, a bench was carved, where paths crossed, stalls appeared. Urban planning wasn't always imposed. It grew from footsteps. Movement sculpted space. So let's walk a while, through a few different cities, and see how life shaped layout. In ancient Athens, the agora was more than a marketplace. It was an arena of civic life. People went there, not just to buy or sell, but to talk, argue, flirt, shout, listen, protest, and the space encouraged that. There were stowers, covered walkways for loitering, shrines tucked between shops, speakers perched on corners, vendors who knew exactly which path had the best foot traffic by midday sun. The agora invited friction, the good kind. Urban democracy needs bumping shoulders. But in other parts of the world, it wasn't an agora, it was a bazaar. Take Isfahan, or Aleppo, or Cordoba. The ancient Islamic bazaar wasn't open-air chaos. It was a calculated maze. Streets narrowed to slow movement. Shops were arranged by type. Perfume here, copper there, fabrics farther in. Roofing created microclimates. Turns and alleys were designed to immerse, not direct. This wasn't inefficient. It was immersive planning. You moved not in a line, but in a loop, drawn by scent, sound, color. The city knew how you thought before you did. And planners? They built with that in mind. Some streets weren't about movement at all. They were about meaning. In Babylon, the processional way was flanked by walls glazed with lions. It led from the Ishtar Gate to the Temple of Marduk. You didn't stroll it casually. You moved with reverence. The street itself told a story. Same with the Via Sacra in Rome. Triumphal processions marched through the city, past monuments, up to the Temple of Jupiter. The route was history made physical, power translated into topography. And in Egypt, some temples had dromos, avenues lined with sphinxes or statues, where rituals paraded under sun and incense. You don't just build those paths, you stage them like theater, like choreography. Urban planning here wasn't for commerce, it was for cosmos. Big boulevards get the credit, but life happened in small spaces. The courtyard was an architectural staple across ancient cultures. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome, China. It offered light, air, privacy, a communal zone where the line between home and city blurred. The courtyard was both private and performative. It was where gossip lived, where stories were passed, where plans were whispered, urban intimacy. Then there were stoops, those little thresholds, not quite inside, not quite street, just enough space to sit, watch, wait, talk. Cities didn't need a town square to feel communal. Sometimes all they needed was a well-placed stare. And ancient planners? They knew this. They placed wells where shade pooled. They placed fountains where sound would echo. They placed stairs where people naturally paused. Urbanism didn't just manage land. It anticipated pause. Every city has a boundary, not just a physical one, but an emotional one. Where does inside begin? When do you feel home? When do you feel watched? In ancient cities, these questions were answered with walls and gates, but not always in the way you think. Yes, walls could be military. They kept out raiders, wild animals, enemies. But walls also created identity. To cross through a city gate wasn't just a logistical action. It was a statement. You were now of the city. You had entered a space where different rules applied. Trade, law, ritual, language, all changed the moment you passed through. And planners knew this, which is why gates weren't just gaps in the wall. They were architectural declarations. Think of the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, covered in bright blue glazed tiles, lions pacing in relief. You didn't just enter the city, you were welcomed by empire itself. Or the Golden Gate of Constantinople, massive, triple-arched, ceremonial. It told you exactly what kind of city you were stepping into, one of legacy, of power, of divine right. Gates could also control flow. Merchants through one entrance, pilgrims through another, soldiers through a separate side, slaves perhaps, not through any gate at all. Planning wasn't just spatial, it was social sorting. Walls, meanwhile, weren't only defense, they were psychological. They offered containment, a sense of safety, of limit. They said, inside here, we understand how life works, even in cities that outgrew their walls, like Rome. The original boundaries continued to influence how space was understood. Some neighborhoods were in, some out, long after the physical walls had crumbled. In many ancient cultures, cities had a sacred boundary, a line you couldn't cross without ritual, a line that made ordinary land extraordinary. The Romans called it the Pomerium, an invisible sacred border that encircled the city of Rome. You could live inside Rome, but outside the Pomerium. You could march into Rome, but not cross that line with weapons. No tombs were allowed inside it, no foreign gods. Even generals couldn't cross it with their armies without becoming tyrants. So what did planners do? They built around it. This meant the location of buildings, especially temples and theaters, had to be negotiated not just with topography or traffic, but with ritual law. And it wasn't just Rome. In ancient China, Feng Shui dictated where structures could go, where energy, qi, could flow, where harmony would be maintained. A mountain here, a river there, the ideal city aligned with the cosmos. If you ignored it, misfortune, rebellion, plague, collapse. Planning wasn't just planning. It was obedience to a metaphysical blueprint. Walls didn't just encircle cities. Sometimes they divided them from within. In Mohenjo-Daro, the citadel was elevated, not necessarily a fortress, but a place of administration, ritual, maybe governance. Ordinary houses lay below. In Roman cities, insulae, rented apartments, clustered in dense quarters, while patricians spread out in villas near aqueducts and markets. In medieval Cairo, trade guilds formed their own quarters. In ancient Beijing, neighborhoods were walled and locked at night. In Teotihuacan, entire ethnic groups had their own compounds. This wasn't urban unity. This was urban choreography. Each class, profession, or identity had a spatial rhythm, their own entrances, their own water access, their own rituals of noise and silence. The planner wasn't just building a city, they were managing difference. And the result? A kind of equilibrium, tense, but often sustainable. Because when everyone has a place, they're more likely to stay in place. If you've ever walked a city at noon, sunlight changes everything. In the ancient world, without air conditioning or street lamps, light and shadow were tools, as real and critical as stone or wood. City planners in hot climates understood this deeply. You'll see it in the narrow, winding alleys of Fez and other Islamic cities, where buildings leaned inward to create natural shade. The colonnades of Athens and Alexandria, offering refuge from the glare. The placement of courtyards in Roman homes, to catch morning light but avoid the brutal noon sun. The layout of temples in Egypt, where shafts of sunlight were aligned to specific days of the year, like solstices or sacred festivals. They weren't just avoiding heat, they were designing emotion, Sunlight made spaces feel open, sacred, or dangerous. Shadow made them intimate, protected, or powerful. The city was a calendar of moving light. We often think of modern cities as noisy, but ancient cities had their own acoustic logic. Without motors or electricity, sound carried differently, and planning took that into account. In Greek theatres, seats were arranged to amplify the human voice, without microphones. In marketplaces, vendors clustered near hard surfaces, walls or corners that bounced sound. In temples, some chambers were acoustically isolated, so the priest's voice could echo as if divine. In Roman bathhouses, the design of domes and vaults created resonance chambers where whispers carried and gossip could fly. Sound wasn't just background, it was architecture. The clang of the smith, the splash of the fountain, the chant from the temple. They weren't random. They were part of how the city taught you to behave. Too loud near the magistrate? Trouble. Too quiet near the marketplace? Bad for sales. Planners knew. Sound guides movement. Now breathe in. Cities smelled, but not just of sewage and smoke. They smelled of place. The fish market at dawn, the tannery by the river, the incense from a shrine, the wet clay of a potter's yard, the baked scent of fresh bread in the courtyard oven. In ancient cities, scent was navigation. You knew you were near the baths by the steam and oil. You found the spice cellar by the wind. You judged a neighborhood by what it smelled like. Some urban spaces were fragrant by design. In Persian gardens, integrated into city centers, fragrant plants were deliberately planted along paths. Jasmine, cypress, citrus, mint. It wasn't just aesthetic. It was atmosphere, a sensory map made of smell. Imagine walking barefoot through a Roman home. The mosaic underfoot isn't just decoration. It's a message to your skin. Cool in summer, warmth where the sun touches it. A shift in material that tells you you're entering a new room. Urban planning also meant designing for texture. In Mesopotamian cities, clay brick streets were rutted with cartwheels, but smoothed by generations of sandals. In ancient China, stone bridges had ribbed surfaces to prevent slipping in rain. In North African cities, walls were rough where climbing was unwelcome, but polished smooth where people leaned. The planner wasn't only thinking about space, they were thinking about contact. What does the city feel like when you touch it? Because people don't just see their cities, they feel them on soles, palms, backs, shoulders, the curve of a wall, the bite of a cobble, the slick of moss in a shaded stairwell. Planning is sensory, always has been. Here's something modern eyes often miss. The rooftop wasn't dead space. In many ancient cities, especially across the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe, rooftops were rooms. In Ur and Babylon, flat mudbrick roofs were used for sleeping during hot nights. In Cairo and Damascus, they were laundry lines, chicken coops, water tanks, and places for quiet prayer. In Rome, multi-story insulae, apartment buildings, had rooftop gardens or communal drying spaces. In the Indus Valley, evidence suggests rooftops were used for social gatherings, repairs, even schooling. These weren't exceptions. They were integral parts of the home. The city didn't end at eye level. It expanded vertically, even without skyscrapers. And with that expansion came a new challenge for planners. Who owns the roof? Who can cross it? Where does one building end and another begin? These weren't abstract concerns. They were matters of law. Ancient urban codes often regulated rooftop access, especially in dense districts. Why? Because rooftops were shortcuts. You could walk across 5 homes without ever touching the ground. So city planning had to think in 3 dimensions. Just as life thrived above, it hid below. Let's start with something deeply human, the need to escape the heat. In Persia, qanats, underground canals, brought water into the city silently, coolly, and efficiently. In Jerusalem, Hezekiah's tunnel twisted beneath the city to bring spring water into the walls. In Rome, the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewage systems, ran for miles beneath temples and forums. In Istanbul, vast cisterns like the Basilica Cistern stored water beneath city streets in haunting columned grandeur. But not everything below was water. There were cellars, catacombs, storage vaults, even secret paths. In Egypt, grain silos were built partially underground to preserve temperature and deter pests. In Greece, temples sometimes had crypts or chthonic chambers where the dead were consulted or gods of the underworld honored. In early Christian cities, networks of catacombs allowed worship when it was forbidden above ground. Planning downward meant engineering in darkness, managing moisture, preventing collapse, and preserving the emotional weight of going under. Because downward always meant something: to store, to hide, to protect, to remember. We tend to think of ancient cities as flat, streets, plazas, ground-level homes. But many cities weren't flat at all. Take Teotihuacan, built in terraces, with platform mounds leading to temples, or Machu Picchu, literally layered into a mountaintop, with distinct urban tiers, or Byzantine Constantinople, where hills shaped neighborhoods and aqueducts ran above eye level across valleys. Even in medieval Cairo, the poorer classes often lived higher, up several flights, because water had to be carried by hand, and fire was harder to fight. So height had meaning, and planning had to think vertically. Can we get water up there? Will the roof hold? How do we drain the rain? Can we carry grain 3 stories without breaking a hip? The ancient city wasn't 2-dimensional. It was a layer cake of classes, temperatures, uses, and materials. Here's where it gets interesting. Because ancient cities didn't just stack vertically while alive. They kept stacking after death. You built a city. It burned, flooded, fell. You didn't clear it away. You built on top of it, layer after layer. It's why modern Rome sits meters above ancient Rome, why the streets of Jerusalem twist over buried walls, why archaeologists in Troy found 9 cities stacked like Russian dolls. Every rebuild was a replanning. Every decision had to reckon with what already existed. Sometimes the past helped. Old walls became foundations. Sometimes it hindered. You couldn't dig a well where bones were buried. Planning wasn't a clean slate. It was a negotiation with ghosts. You can't build a city without water. It's the first rule, the first boundary, the first magnet. Every ancient settlement began near a source, a river, a spring, a lake, a seasonal floodplain. But access wasn't enough. You had to control it. Let's start with the Indus Valley. In Mohenjo-Daro, they built with water in mind. Houses had drains, streets had slopes, Wells were shared, and there, right in the middle of the city, was the Great Bath, lined with bricks and bitumen, possibly used for ritual purification. Water wasn't just utility, it was cosmic. It cleansed, it united, it made the city alive. Now, head west, to Rome. They mastered water like no one else. The aqueducts carried fresh water across valleys and hills, using nothing but gravity and stone. A single aqueduct could deliver millions of gallons per day. And where did that water go? Fountains on every corner, public baths the size of stadiums, latrines with running water, homes of the wealthy with personal cisterns, gardens, cooling pools, even plumbing for heating. Rome wasn't just a city with water, it was a performance of water. And the infrastructure wasn't buried, it was celebrated. Bridges, arches, and channels stood as monuments to control. The city declared, "We master nature here." Meanwhile, in desert cities, like Petra in Jordan, the story flipped. Here, every drop mattered. The Nabateans carved channels into cliffs, built hidden reservoirs, and designed systems to capture runoff from flash floods. The city was a sponge, not a fountain. In all these places, the planning wasn't just technical, it was emotional, because water was memory, drought was trauma. To plan well meant to honor fear and hope at once. Now the part no one wants to talk about, but every planner had to. What do you do with the rest, the waste, the sewage, the garbage, the rot? If you get it wrong, your city stinks. People get sick. Rats dance. If you get it right, your city breathes clean. Let's go back to ancient Rome again, because yes, they had sewers. The Cloaca Maxima, built over 2,500 years ago, still exists. It drained the Forum. It flushed toilets. It carried off storm water. But it wasn't the only one. Roman cities often had entire underground waste networks, and they were connected to public latrines, communal, surprisingly hygienic, and even social. Now travel to Mohenjo-Daro again. This city had a street-level drainage system, lined with bricks, covered with slabs. Household waste flowed into it. Some homes had private toilets. We're talking 2600 BCE. They were already managing sanitation by design. Elsewhere, in ancient Athens, refuse pits were common. In Mesopotamia, cesspits were sealed and emptied by laborers. In Mesoamerica, waste was sometimes repurposed as fertilizer, carefully managed and valued. Planners weren't just moving water, they were moving filth, and doing it without pumps, trucks, or plastic. They used gravity, elevation, clay, routine. The system had to be invisible, but never neglected, because bad waste planning meant plague, and plague could end a city faster than any war. But there's more to flow than water and waste. In many ancient cities, rituals govern movement, of liquids, of goods, of people. In Jerusalem, ritual baths called mikvahs were built into neighborhoods and homes, each with a precise system of steps, separation, and drainage. In Vedic India, temples were surrounded by tanks and ponds, where worshippers bathed before prayer. In Celtic Europe, sacred wells were marked with stones and offerings. In all these cases, the water infrastructure wasn't just functional, it was sacred. It shaped behavior. It encoded belief. Planners placed fountains, not just for thirst, but for pause. They placed wells where the sun struck them at dawn. They shaped cisterns to echo prayers. Flow wasn't just engineering, it was ethics. To plan water well was a moral act, and in the best cities, it still is. You know what makes a city feel like a city? The smell of bread. Walk through any ancient street in the morning, Rome, Thebes, Nineveh, Chang'an, and you'd smell it. Grains grinding, dough rising, ovens roaring. Feeding a dense population without trucks or refrigeration was a logistical miracle. Let's break it down. Most ancient cities didn't grow their food. They imported it. The land inside the walls was too valuable or too crowded to waste on crops. So planning revolved around food movement. In Rome, grain arrived from Egypt in vast cargo ships. It was stored in massive warehouses, horea, rationed and distributed in public. The state even provided grain to the poor in a form of welfare, the annona. To make that possible, Rome built port facilities at Ostia, inland warehouses, a carefully timed distribution network, dedicated roads to move grain, flour, and bread. Planners weren't just paving streets, they were calibrating hunger. Other cities had different methods. In Angkor, rice paddies were integrated into city design, fed by canals and reservoirs. Food was grown within the city's hydraulic system. In Mesoamerica, markets sold maize, beans, cacao, and squash, brought in daily by foot or canoe. Tenochtitlan's market at Tlatelolco was said to serve tens of thousands of people a day. No trucks, no freezers, no barcodes, just planning, habit, and muscle memory, and a whole lot of donkeys. But the ancient market wasn't just a food zone, it was a brain. The agora in Athens, the forum in Rome, the bazaar in Aleppo, these weren't just shopping spaces. They were courts, newsrooms, classrooms, theatres, parliaments, sanctuaries, gossip hubs, and they were planned to be all of those things. Markets were placed at central crossroads, near temples or government buildings. They were designed with acoustics, shade, drainage, and security in mind. You didn't just stumble upon a market, you were guided into it, and the layout itself encoded logic. Fresh goods up front, livestock farther back, ironmongers on the edge, because, well, the smell. Priests with incense or sacred trinkets near shrines. Planning wasn't passive. It was a spatial argument about how society should flow. And the more a city grew, the more planners had to regulate the market, limit noise, prevent overcrowding, set prices, avoid fires. Because speaking of fire, nothing terrified an ancient city like fire. It wasn't just destructive, it was contagious. In dense cities made of wood, clay, thatch, and oil lamps, a single spark could level entire neighborhoods. Which is why fire planning wasn't an afterthought. It was central to design. In Rome, after the Great Fire of 64 CE, Emperor Nero issued new building codes, minimum spacing between buildings, mandated use of fireproof stone, widened streets to act as fire breaks. Some cities designated fire brigades, public or private. In Rome, the vigiles were a kind of firefighter-police hybrid. In Alexandria, wells and cisterns were placed to support fire suppression. City layouts also considered wind direction to limit fire spread, proximity to water, materials used in construction, and in markets, often the most flammable spaces. Planners limited open flames, required permits for certain trades, or mandated early closure during dry seasons. Even street width was about 5. Too narrow, the blaze spreads faster. Too wide, harder to control crowds. Planning was a balancing act between safety, density, and function. Because if your city feeds its people, but can't protect them from fire, it's a tinderbox with bread. Every house is a city in miniature. It has boundaries, flow, zones of quiet and commotion, private places, public places, transitional spaces, storage, ritual. Planners of ancient cities understood this. They weren't just designing streets. They were shaping the interface between city and self. Let's start with ancient Rome, where homes were sharply stratified. The domus, a wealthy person's urban house, usually had an atrium, central hall, a tablinum, office or receiving room, bedrooms, cubicula, and often a private garden, peristyle. The insula, apartment blocks, often crowded and fire-prone, home to the majority of Rome's population. Renters lived above shops. The higher the floor, the cheaper and more dangerous. These two types of housing demanded two types of planning: wide streets and plumbing for the domus districts, narrow lanes, fire precautions, and waste removal for insular heavy quarters. In Greece, homes turned inward. Most had courtyards for air, light, and domestic life. Windows faced the interior, not the street. Privacy mattered. So did shade. In Mesopotamia, homes often had flat roofs and enclosed courtyards. Mud brick walls were thick to buffer heat and sound. Even in Egypt, homes adapted to the Nile's rhythms, elevated when floods came, oriented to catch the prevailing breeze, structured to separate animals from sleeping areas. And in China, the Siheyuan, courtyard house, was a geometric ideal: 4 buildings enclosing an open space, symbolizing balance and harmony. These homes weren't just shelters, they were expressions of value. What should be hidden? Where should guests enter? Who sleeps near whom? Which direction should the house face? Every home was a planner's whisper about climate, class, gender, belief. In many ancient cities, space was gendered, not just in temples or markets, but in houses, streets, even time of day. In classical Athens, women of citizen families rarely went out unaccompanied. Homes were divided into male and female quarters. Public space belonged to men, until festivals or funerals made it otherwise. In India, architectural treatises like the Vastu Shastra advised on spatial orientation that often reinforced gender roles, assigning rooms based on cosmic and social hierarchy. In Islamic cities, privacy was codified in design. Mashrabia, latticed windows, allowed women to see the street without being seen. Courtyards became secure, social worlds. Separate entrances were often built for men and women. None of this was accidental. Urban space was a mirror of social control. Even the layout of streets, some curved to prevent line of sight into homes, carried moral geometry. Today, we call it zoning or privacy design. Back then, it was honor. Don't let the mud walls fool you. Ancient homes were often clever. Take Rome again. Heated floors, hippocausts in elite homes, running water in upper-class residences, lead pipes, unfortunately, that supplied private fountains and sinks. In Mohenjo-Daro, homes had private wells, toilets connected to brick-lined drains, standardized brick sizes for maintenance ease. In China, underfloor heating, Kang systems, were used for centuries. In Andean cities, walls were tilted slightly inward for earthquake resistance. These homes weren't passive. They were adaptive technologies, modular, evolving, and often deeply sustainable. Planning wasn't just about public works. It extended into the hearth. Every ancient home had at least one sacred space. In Roman houses, the lararium, a shrine to household gods. In Hindu homes, a puja room or alcove for daily offerings. In Chinese homes, an ancestral tablet or altar. In Egyptian homes, wall niches for amulets, images of protective deities. In early Christian homes, crosses, relics, or small icons hidden in walls. These weren't optional extras. They were the heart of the home. Planning even the smallest dwelling included orientation. Which direction should the shrine face? Cleanliness. Ritual spaces had to be protected from waste and impurity. Access. Who could enter? Who could tend it? The city may have had temples, but the first prayers were whispered at home, and every planner knew homes make citizens, not through architecture alone, but through space that teaches people how to live. The first question every city faced was simple. Where do we put the dead? The answer? It depended on culture, climate, class, and belief. In many cities, the dead were placed outside the walls. Roman law prohibited burial within city limits. The roads leading into Rome, like the Via Appia, were lined with tombs. In Athens, the Kerameikos cemetery sat just beyond the city's gates. This wasn't just about hygiene. It was about liminality, the edge, the threshold between the world of the living and the world beyond. But not all cultures agreed. In ancient Egypt, burial was part of the city's identity. The necropolis of Giza wasn't remote. It was a mirror city, full of pyramids, mastabas, and tomb temples just across the Nile. The dead lived nearby, spiritually, if not physically. In China, royal tombs were enormous landscapes of meaning. The afterlife as empire, complete with buried armies, chariots, and palaces. In the Americas, cities like Monte Alban and Tikal built temples over tombs, elevating death into architecture. And in many smaller, humbler cities, families buried their dead in courtyards or under floors. The home was also a tomb, and memory had a local address. Planning for death wasn't just a matter of where, it was also how. A city's relationship with death reveals what it values most. Take the pyramids. They weren't houses for the dead. They were machines for remembrance. Planning them meant aligning with stars, engineering corridors and chambers, organizing massive labor teams, creating entire funerary economies. They shaped the city's skyline and its soul. In Rome, emperors built mausoleums like the one that became Castel Sant'Angelo, tombs that doubled as fortresses, eventually as prisons. Death became infrastructure. In Persia, Zoroastrians used towers of silence, raised platforms where the dead were exposed to the elements and birds. It was a different logic. No tomb, no shrine, just return. Planners had to navigate these beliefs with care. How much land should a tomb take? Who maintains it? What happens when space runs out? Even today, Old cities face this. The cemeteries grow cramped. New tombs squeeze beside old ones. And somewhere beneath the cobbles, always, someone is buried. The journey to death mattered just as much as the final place. In many cities, funeral processions were ritual events, planned into the fabric of streets. Roman funerals moved from home to forum to necropolis. Egyptian rituals followed the Nile. Chinese processions honored cardinal directions and geomancy. In Mesoamerica, the dead were sometimes buried with maps to help them navigate the afterlife. This meant that routes were sacred. Planners sometimes designed avenues just for ritual movement. In Angkor, roads to temples doubled as processional ways. In early Christian cities, pilgrimage paths to martyr tombs shaped entire neighborhoods. A city wasn't just for the living, it was a stage for mourning. Here's something strange to modern ears. In many ancient cities, the dead owned land. Tombs had legal status. Ancestral plots couldn't be sold. Maintaining a grave was often a family obligation, and failure could bring shame or even legal trouble. This meant that planners had to factor in immovable property. A street couldn't simply cut through a cemetery. A market couldn't expand into sacred ground unless rituals were performed, debts paid, and sometimes spirits appeased. Even city expansions had to respect the bones, because to many, disturbing the dead wasn't just taboo, it was cosmic offense. Picture this: morning sunlight hitting polished stone, a murmuring crowd, someone shouting, another praying, children darting between vendors, and in the middle, empty space, charged with purpose. That's the plaza. From the Agora in Athens to the Zocalo in Tenochtitlan, these were more than empty squares. They were where a city breathed, spoke, danced, wept, voted, and remembered. In Greece, the Agora was marketplace and meeting point. It was deliberately placed, central, open, accessible from multiple directions. Temples lined it. So did stoas, covered colonnades, where philosophers argued and merchants haggled. Planning an agora meant balancing traffic and stillness, commerce and contemplation, sun and shade, ritual and randomness. In Rome, the Forum took this idea and formalized it. No longer just a flat space, it was a curated gallery of politics, religion, and imperial propaganda. Basilicas, curiae, temples, arches, all organized to impress. Later, emperors built entire imperial forums, each a statement of authority and ideology. Augustus even carved into his forum, "I found Rome of brick, I leave it of marble." In Tenochtitlan, the central plaza was massive, bordered by pyramids, temples, and palaces. In Beijing, the Forbidden City's vast courtyards echoed this rhythm, space as both stage and filter. And in Islamic cities, the Maidan served as both square and prayer space, especially on Fridays. Plazas weren't afterthoughts. They were the thrones of the people. Planners considered airflow, acoustics, processions, surveillance, because these spaces held everything a ruler feared and needed: the crowd. Now shift to another kind of gathering, the performance. In ancient cities, the theatre wasn't fringe, it was core. In Athens, theatres were carved into hillsides, like the theatre of Dionysus, where tragedies and comedies became civic rituals. These weren't just stories, they were moral discussions, legal debates disguised as drama, the city putting its soul on trial. Planners oriented the theater to face sacred landmarks, maximize acoustics without microphones, offer shade when possible, channel foot traffic efficiently. The shape, semicircular, tiered, open, became so iconic it still defines modern venues. In Rome, the form evolved into the amphitheater. The Colosseum, of course, is the crown jewel, but hundreds dotted the empire, from North Africa to Britain. These arenas were machines of mass emotion. Planners built them to move tens of thousands of people in and out swiftly, separate social classes by seating tiers, include underground chambers for lifts, animals, gladiators, control light and shade with retractable canopies, velaria. The spectacle wasn't just for fun, it was for control. Bread and circuses, after all. Public life didn't just unfold in plazas or theaters. Streets themselves were stages. In Rome, the triumphal procession was a key urban event. A victorious general paraded from the Campus Martius through the city to the Temple of Jupiter. The route was sacred and deliberately designed. Temples, arches, and monuments were aligned for maximum effect. In Byzantine cities, religious processions determined where streets widened or fountains were placed. In Islamic cities, streets leading to the main mosque were often wider, shaded, and sometimes arcaded, anticipating Friday crowds. Planners had to think about flow under pressure, emergency dispersal, symbolic sight lines, visibility for rulers or gods. Urban form became ceremonial choreography. Even in marketplaces, the arrangement of stalls, mosques, and caravanserais obeyed deeper rhythms, anticipating holidays, pilgrimages, feasts. Because to plan a city well meant to plan its drama. All this comes down to one thing: the idea that a city isn't just for shelter, it's for participation. In Greece, the polis was defined not by walls, but by the people who debated within it. In Rome, citizenship involved spaces where you voted, bathed, pled your case. In Mesoamerica, public ball courts had spiritual political significance, binding the city to cosmic order. Urban planning wasn't just about moving bodies, it was about shaping minds, where you stood, who you saw, what you heard. It all trained you in how to belong. That's civic architecture at its deepest. Not just design, but ritualized inclusion, even if exclusion often followed. Imagine walking into a city for the first time. What draws your eye? In many ancient cities, the answer was immediate: the temple. Not just because of its height or ornamentation, but because of its placement. Temples were often the most deliberately positioned buildings in any city. At the highest point, the Acropolis in Athens. At the axis of major roads, like the Temple of Jupiter in Rome. Near water, markets, or gates, where daily life pulsed. This wasn't random. Planners coordinated temples with cardinal directions, celestial alignments, seasonal light, acoustics, even the smell and sound of surrounding streets. In Babylon, the ziggurat of Etemenanke stood as a cosmic ladder, reaching from the earthly chaos below to the heavens above. Its placement, symbolic, tactical, theological. In Teotihuacan, the Temple of the Sun aligns with the setting sun on specific days. In Angkor, temples mirror cosmological maps. In Jerusalem, The Temple Mount shaped the city's very soul. These were not just religious spaces. They were cosmic diagrams, drawn in stone. But not all sacred spaces were towering. In fact, the most common holy places in ancient cities were household shrines, street altars, sacred trees, springs or wells, niches tucked into walls. City planning accounted for all of these. Some neighborhoods had chapels on every block. Markets often had their own gods, their own priests. Fishermen worshipped near docks, merchants near toll gates. The sacred was localized, and that meant planners needed to design around festivals, allow for offerings, plan waste removal, burnt offerings, animal sacrifices, maintain visual access for ritual processions. Even sewer systems might bend around a shrine. You didn't just bulldoze a god. Temples weren't only visual, they were sonic landscapes. Chanting, bells, silence, all had architectural needs. In Egyptian temples, long corridors amplified echoes. In Greek temples, open columns and courtyards managed crowd noise. In Hindu temples, inner sanctums, garbhagriha, were small, dark, resonant, meant to humble. Planning involved buffer zones from city noise, water features to purify or hush, light wells for specific times of day, elevation for visibility and pilgrimage. Even approach routes were calculated. Long paths, processional stairways, arched gates. You didn't stumble upon a temple, you arrived. Temples shaped cities, not just by presence, but by prohibition. Many had zones around them where certain trades were banned, sounds were restricted, animals weren't allowed, only priests could enter. This created spatial buffer zones, sometimes used for gardens, water basins, or idol gathering. In Rome, temples often doubled as archives or treasuries. In Thebes, the Karnak temple complex included living quarters, schools, and even kitchens for priests and their families. So planners had to think broadly: access for ritual animals, drainage for blood and water, storage for offerings, housing for priests, safety for sacred artifacts. Temples were micro-cities within cities, and their needs shaped everything around them. Some cities weren't just religious, they were born of religion, like Mecca, which grew around the Kaaba, or Varanasi, where the Ganges flows past shrines by the dozen, or Delphi, a spiritual magnet whose oracle made it one of the most influential places in the Greek world. In these cases, planning had to accommodate pilgrim traffic, seasonal crowds, marketplace sprawl, ritual lodging, processional paths, holy water access. These weren't cities with temples, they were temples with cities. And the planner's job wasn't just architectural, it was logistical theology. Walls didn't just mark the edge of a city, they made the city. Archaeologists often define a settlement as a city once it shows evidence of urban planning and some form of enclosure. Why? Because walls meant protection from invasion, control of entry and exit, visual identity, a line between us and them. In Uruk, one of the earliest cities, massive walls surrounded the city-state as early as 3000 BCE. Not only functional, they were symbolic, tied to kingship, divinity, and civic pride. In Jericho, stone walls with towers date back even further, hinting that defense was one of the earliest communal efforts of any permanent human settlement. The design of city walls was never arbitrary. Planners considered topography, hills, cliffs, rivers, building material, stone, mudbrick, later concrete, labor supply, strategic weak points, integration with natural features. For example, in Athens, the city was protected not only by its Acropolis, but also by the long walls that connected it to its port, Piraeus, ensuring food supply even during siege. In Xi'an, China, the wall was rectilinear, square with guard towers at regular intervals, designed as much for ceremony and display as for war. The height mattered, both for archers and for awe. The thickness varied, sometimes wide enough to ride a chariot on, and often planners had to choose moats or bastions, towers or ditches, earthen berms or stone curtain walls. Walls weren't just about keeping people out. They were also about letting the right people in. And for that, ancient cities built gates, controlled access points that were as symbolic as they were strategic. In Babylon, the Ishtar Gate was a massive, glazed brick masterpiece, a gateway not only into the city, but into its mythology and pride. In Rome, gates were named for the roads they faced: Porta Appia, Porta Flaminia, Porta Capena. Each connected Rome to a different region, like arteries of empire. But gates weren't just holes in the wall. They had guardhouses, trap mechanisms, viewing platforms, customs booths, ritual functions, and they were planned with care, facing lucky directions, aligned with temples, wide enough for carts, narrow enough for control. The gate was both welcome mat and choke point, a paradox in stone. As warfare evolved, so did planning. Moats, whether dry or wet, added a layer of separation. They also channeled sewage or rain runoff, solving two problems with one trench. Watchtowers allowed surveillance far beyond the wall, critical for early warning and psychological deterrence. Some cities, like medieval Carcassonne, featured concentric walls, one inside another, forcing enemies through gauntlets, and planners had to calculate slope angles, field of fire, blind spots, wind direction for smoke and fire arrows, material decay over time. Even the resonance of a gatehouse chamber mattered. Could defenders hear alarms or shouts clearly? Defensive planning was engineering and theatre, because it wasn't enough to be safe. You had to look safe. But here's the twist. Walls didn't just shape cities. They shaped people. They defined who was inside and who wasn't, who had rights, who paid taxes, who was protected. And they did something subtler. They taught citizens to think in boundaries. Even when cities outgrew their walls, the walls stayed in the maps, the minds, the metaphors. Outside the pale, beyond the wall, intramural versus extramural. City planners, knowingly or not, were also social engineers. Let's start with the most obvious: roads. They're so normal, we forget how revolutionary they were. But in the ancient world, a well-planned road wasn't just about trade. It was about control, mobility, and connection. In Mesopotamia, early cities were laced with narrow, twisting streets, designed more by footpath than ruler. But even then, certain roads were widened, paved, or aligned to major gates or temples. The Romans, of course, took it to another level. Over 400,000 kilometers of roads, 29 military highways radiating from Rome itself, milestones every mile, drainage ditches, curbstones, and rest stops, built in layers, sand, gravel, mortar, paving stone, engineered for centuries, not seasons, and critically, planned with imperial precision. Each road had a name, a destination, and often a political agenda. You could say Roman power wasn't broadcast by swords, but by stonework. But they weren't alone. In China, under the Qin and Han dynasties, massive road networks were created, some straight as arrows for miles, others weaving with the land. These roads connected capitals, markets, and military outposts. In Persia, the royal road stretched 2,700 kilometers, from Susa to Sardis, with way stations, rest houses, and even mounted couriers, precursors to postal systems. And in the Americas, the Incan road system carved through mountains, engineered with switchbacks, rope bridges, and drainage channels that still work today. Planning a road wasn't just about going from A to B. It was about knowing what happens between and who controls it. If roads carried people, water carried life. The moment a city grew past a few hundred people, water had to be engineered. No more scooping from a stream, no more counting on rainfall. And so, aqueducts, qanats, cisterns, canals, wells, drains, fountains. Let's take a look. In Rome, the aqueduct was an art form. Gravity-powered channels that could span valleys on stone arches, subterranean tunnels carved with mathematical precision, reservoirs, settling tanks, lead and terracotta pipes, delivered to fountains, baths, gardens, homes, even flushing toilets. At its height, Rome had 11 aqueduct systems, delivering over 1 million cubic meters of water a day. In Persia, the Qanat system was a marvel. Underground channels dug at a slope, capturing groundwater from distant mountains, maintained by vertical shafts, often miles long, provided constant clean water to cities in arid regions. In India, stepwells and tanks collected seasonal monsoons. In Mohenjo-Daro, every house had a drain. In Angkor, massive barrages, water reservoirs, formed an entire hydraulic civilization. Planning water meant planning source and pressure, flow rate and purity, public access versus private control, seasonal variation, wastewater management, and perhaps most astonishingly, planners often got it right for centuries. Now to the least glamorous, but arguably most civilized invention, the sewer. Because once you've got water coming in, you'd better have a way to get it out. In Rome, the Cloaca Maxima still runs. Built in the 6th century BCE, it was originally a canal that turned into a city-wide drainage and waste system. Planners designed gradients for flow, covered tunnels for hygiene, grates, vents, inspection hatches, access for cleaning, usually slaves or convicts. In Harappan cities, brick-lined drains connected nearly every home, some with manholes. In medieval Islamic cities, waste was often collected at night and taken outside the city by donkeys, a primitive but consistent system. And in pre-Columbian America, some cities had designated defecation areas, downwind, downhill, and ritually cleaned. No one likes talking about waste, but managing it was one of the first signs of urban maturity. City planners who ignored sanitation learned quickly. Disease didn't care about your empire. Not all cities had plumbing, but where it existed, it was revolutionary. In Rome, some elite homes had indoor toilets, heated baths, running fountains, water clocks, lead pipes, unfortunately toxic over time, public baths, thermae, required massive infrastructure, caldarium, hot, tepidarium, warm, frigidarium, cold, hypercast heating, constant water supply, social zoning by class and gender. In Islamic cities, hammams performed similar functions and were often connected to mosques and markets. Planning such places meant understanding flow and fire, cleanliness and ritual purity, fuel access, water turnover, ventilation. Even today, plumbing is the most expensive part of city infrastructure. Back then, it was politics made visible. Who got water? Who got heat? Who got to bathe? And where? Infrastructure wasn't neutral. It expressed power. Let's start with the obvious, the market. Not the sterile, fluorescent-lit kind, but the ancient bazaar, a place of color and noise, of scents and shouts and sudden encounters, a place that moved. In Mesopotamian cities, open squares near temples served as the first structured markets. The temple oversaw grain storage, pricing, weights, even fair trade. By the time we get to classical Greece, the agora had already become a planned space of economic, social, and civic convergence. Food stalls next to philosophers, fishmongers beside jurists. In Islamic cities, the souk, or bazaar, was an urban marvel. Not just one place, but a system. Narrow, covered lanes. Specialization by craft or trade. Gold souk, spice souk, fabric souk. Caravanserais nearby for incoming merchants. Mosques integrated for ritual rhythm. Gates closed at night for security. Planning this wasn't random. It involved wind flow to cool spaces, reduce fire risk. Material zoning, no tanneries near perfumes. Width and curvature of alleys. Drainage for food waste. Light wells above cloth stalls for color inspection. In Mesoamerican cities like Tlatelolco, markets served tens of thousands daily. Cortes wrote of their scale in awe, twice as large as that of Salamanca. Planners didn't just allow trade, they orchestrated it. Markets seem messy, but beneath the chaos is deep structure. Take the grid layout in Roman colonies. Markets, macella, were often placed near forums for bureaucratic oversight, at street intersections for maximum footfall, away from temples or elite housing, but not too far. Inside the macellum, circular or rectangular plan, perimeter stalls, central fountain or altar, drainage channels built in. In medieval Islamic cities, the design was more organic, following foot traffic, slope, shade, and noise patterns. But even there, invisible rules governed where spice sellers sat, where blacksmiths hammered, and where beggars stood. Planners had to think, where would smells flow? How much sound would bounce? What kind of lighting would a jeweler need? Could a donkey turn around in this alley? Urban planning had to feel spontaneous, even when it wasn't. Markets weren't just about the visible stalls. They needed back ends, warehouses, weighing stations, grain silos, livestock pens, trash pits, tally courts. In Athens, the Matroon housed both the city's archives and some market supplies. In Palmyra, customs houses collected tariffs on goods crossing from east to west. In Alexandria, vast granaries supported Rome's bread supply. City planners needed to maintain food freshness, ventilation, sun, prevent spoilage and rot, avoid fire near flammables, track taxation flow, manage currency zones. Some markets used multiple coinage systems. It's easy to forget that logistics is ancient, but it is, and planners were its first practitioners. Markets weren't just for things, they were for stories. In ancient cities, people learned about foreign lands through spices, fabrics, maps, politics through gossip, pamphlets, scribes, religion through preaching, amulets, rituals, language through bargaining and bartering. So planners had to think like psychologists. Where would a speaker stand? Would crowds linger or flow? Could a blind man find his way? Was there shade for the tired, water for the thirsty? Planning a market was planning the soul of the city, and every inch mattered. Eventually, something curious happened. As markets grew more successful, the stalls themselves became property. A shop in a good location wasn't just a workplace, it was an asset, a lease, a legacy. In many cities, shop fronts passed from parent to child. Rentals were regulated. Merchants formed guilds or waqfs, endowments. The value of space began to rival the value of goods. Planning had to respond. Stalls became permanent. Streets were widened. Tax codes emerged. Even insurance began against fire, theft, collapse. And so the city turned again toward that now familiar word, real estate. Let's begin with one of the most evocative and least functional parts of a city, the garden. It might seem like a luxury now, like a thing added when everything else is done. But in many ancient cities, gardens were central. In Persia, the concept of the paradise garden was born, enclosed by walls, divided into 4 quarters, Shahar Bagh, water flowing in channels between trees, often attached to palaces or temples. But these weren't just pretty spots. They were cosmic metaphors, representing the Garden of Eden, the universe's divine balance, or the ruler's power to impose order on nature. In Mesopotamia, rulers built palace gardens with exotic plants, imported through long-distance trade, sometimes with inscriptions detailing every tree and its origin. In Egypt, tomb paintings show rows of neatly planted trees, pools filled with fish and lotuses, shaded walkways, spaces for contemplation and pleasure. Yes, but also spiritual cleansing. The Romans were famous for their peristyle gardens, often at the center of elite homes, trimmed hedges, sculptures, small fountains, enclosed by a colonnade. City planners, especially in elite districts, had to account for these private oases. They weren't public parks, but they shaped block layouts, water pressure systems, and even neighborhood status. Were there public parks? Sometimes, yes, but they looked very different from what we think of today. In Rome, emperors occasionally built public gardens, the gardens of Sallust, the Horti Mæcenatis, the gardens of Agrippa. These were part political gift, part vanity project, designed to win favor with the masses or immortalize the donor's name. In Islamic cities, green space often took the form of courtyards in mosques, madrasas, and caravanserais, small but crucial, offering silence, shade, and water in hot climates. In China, garden design became a philosophy. The scholar's garden in Suzhou, for example, was more than landscape. It was poetry made physical. Planners of such spaces had to anticipate crowd flow, channel breezes and shade, use plantings to shape movement, frame views like living paintings. A well-designed garden was a theatre of serenity, where cities put their dead, says a lot about how they saw life. In early settlements, burial might happen under the floor of the house, especially for children or elders. But as cities grew, death had to be zoned. In most ancient cities, cemeteries were placed outside the city walls: Romans, Greeks, Mesopotamians. Near water: Ganges in India, Nile in Egypt. Along major roads, Romans again, tombs lined the Appian Way. This wasn't just about health, it was about liminality. Death existed on the border, between this world and the next, but it still needed planning. Tombs took up space, mausoleums needed materials, shrines required maintenance, cemeteries demanded drainage, ritual access, protection from theft, design for annual processions or offerings. In China, feng shui governed burial orientation, forcing planners to balance cosmic harmony with practical land use. In Mesoamerica, some pyramids were tombs, others temples, and some both. You couldn't separate the sacred from the civic. It's easy to assume that ancient cities were constant noise, and in many ways they were. Markets, carts, crowds, animals, construction. But people still carved out quiet zones, and planning them wasn't easy. Monasteries, set apart, walled, self-contained. Libraries, with thick walls, central courtyards, few windows. Baths, in Rome and Byzantium, designed with calming acoustics. Temples, built to muffle sound or amplify whispers, depending on belief. Water features, not decorative alone, also audio buffers. Planners knew how to shape sound, and sound shapes mind. You know what's strange? In many ancient cities, beauty was mandatory. In Greece, cities placed statues, not just for gods, but for civic identity. In Rome, the emperor's image appeared in fountains, arches, public toilets, even sewers. In Islamic cities, geometric tilework decorated walls no one ever touched. In Japan, Kyoto's layout followed Shinto cosmology, ensuring not just function, but elegance. Planning wasn't just about efficiency, it was about what kind of feeling the city created. Because people live differently in beautiful spaces. They walk slower, they speak softer, they think longer. Cities were never homogeneous. They were patchworks of difference, from the sprawling palaces of kings to cramped quarters of laborers. Urban space was a map of society. In Rome, the wealthy lived in domus, with atriums and gardens. Poorer citizens crowded into insulae, multi-story apartment blocks, often overcrowded and prone to fire. The elite districts had wider streets and running water. The poorer areas were dense, noisy, and sometimes dangerous. In Athens, the dems, districts, were both political and social units. Some neighborhoods were known for craftsmen, others for traders, others for scholars. In Egyptian cities, proximity to temples or the Nile often dictated housing quality. And in Mohenjo-Daro, the relative uniformity of houses suggests an egalitarian urban plan, though some homes did have private wells and baths. Planners worked within these social realities. Neighborhood layouts balanced security, convenience, and social order. The family unit shaped housing. Ancient homes reflected family size, gender roles, and social expectations. In Mesopotamia, houses were often multi-generational. In China, the Siheyuan enclosed multiple generations around a courtyard. In Rome, space was divided between public reception rooms and private family quarters. In Greece, women's quarters, gynaeconitis, were often separated from men's. Planning for families meant balancing privacy and community. Walls weren't just physical barriers, they were social ones. Land ownership was complex. In many cities, elite families owned large plots. Commoners often rented. Legal documents from Mesopotamia show contracts for leasing shops and houses. In Rome, rental markets thrived, with rules about leases and evictions. In Islamic cities, Waqf trusts often managed property for religious or charitable purposes. This meant planners had to accommodate a fluid housing market. Buildings were repaired, subdivided, or expanded as populations shifted. The city wasn't static. It was a living organism adapting to demand. In ancient cities, the boundary between public and private was often porous. Streets and courtyards mingled. Neighbors shared wells and ovens. Markets spilled into alleys. Temples opened into homes. Planning had to respect and sometimes enforce these fluid boundaries. In Islamic cities, the concept of haram, private, protected space, guided design. In Greek cities, public fountains and wells were gathering spots. In Rome, streets themselves were social spaces, not just thoroughfares. The city wasn't divided into neat zones. It was a living quilt. Every house expressed something about its inhabitants and their place in the world. Grand homes displayed wealth through courtyards, mosaics, and frescoes. Smaller homes might be decorated simply but thoughtfully. In some cultures, homes had shrines or ancestral altars, connecting the present to the past. And for all, location mattered. A house near the market meant commerce, near a temple, spiritual prestige, near the city walls, safety or exile. Planning wasn't just about efficiency, it was about meaning. The political heart of a city often beat in its forum, palace, or council hall, spaces designed to project authority and enable governance. In Rome, the Forum Romanum was more than a marketplace. It housed temples, basilicas for legal proceedings, senate meeting places, and open spaces for assemblies. The Forum was both stage and courtroom. In Athens, the Nix was the gathering spot for citizens to debate and vote. It was deliberately open, accessible, and symbolic of democracy. In Mesopotamian cities, palace complexes served administrative and religious functions, housing scribes, priests, and rulers. Their sprawling layouts controlled access through courtyards and guarded gates, symbolizing power. Ancient cities required bureaucracy to function. From scribal schools in Mesopotamia, where record keepers were trained, to tax offices in Rome and chancelleries in Egypt, these spaces were crucial. Storage rooms packed with clay tablets, scrolls, or papyri were planned carefully to protect knowledge. Planning included lighting, security, and climate control as best as possible. In Persia, Royal road stations doubled as administrative hubs, managing communication and tax collection. Cities needed ways to enforce order. Some housed prisons near administrative centers, like Rome's Mamertine prison. Military barracks, like the castra in Roman colonies, were laid out on strict grids, ready to deploy troops swiftly. Urban policing was early, but evolving. Vigiles in Rome acted as firefighters and night watch. Planning considered proximity of barracks to unrest-prone districts, surveillance points, detention facilities, access routes for rapid response. The city's safety was planned, sometimes down to the detail of alley widths and gate placements. Power spoke in stone and bronze, triumphal arches, statues of emperors, monumental fountains. These were urban propaganda. Their placement was deliberate, at crossroads, near temples or government buildings, in plazas where crowds gathered. They told stories of conquest, divine favor, and civic virtue. Planning had to balance grandiosity with functionality. Too many monuments cluttered space, too few, and power looked weak. Rulers used cities as theater. Public assemblies, trials, festivals, and parades were staged in spaces crafted to awe and control. The architecture channeled movement, controlled sight lines, and amplified sound. Even city gates and walls were decorated with symbols of might. Power was an experience, built, planned, and rehearsed. Ancient planners knew streets weren't just paths. They were lifelines. In Rome, streets were carefully layered and paved to endure heavy use. Traffic flowed along the Cardo and Decumanus, main thoroughfares that connected city gates and markets. Narrower lanes wove into residential neighborhoods. Roman engineers built bridges like the Pons Fabricius, durable stone spans that connected islands and districts. Traffic rules were surprisingly detailed. Processions had priority. Carts were restricted at certain times. Pedestrians shared space with animals and vehicles. In China, cities like Chang'an featured wide avenues and multiple gates to regulate flow. Urban planning had to anticipate bottlenecks, congestion, and emergency access. Cities were buzzing centers of information. In Mesopotamia, scribes wrote on tablets that were couriered between temples, palaces, and merchants. In Persia, the royal road enabled swift communication using mounted couriers and relay stations. In Rome, messages could travel hundreds of miles in days, vital for governance and military coordination. Cities also used visual signals, beacon fires, flag systems, sound signals, horns, bells. Public spaces often served as centers for announcements and proclamations. Planning for communication meant placing notice boards, ensuring acoustic clarity, and managing crowd flow. Markets weren't just for goods, they were for gossip, politics, and news. In many cities, the marketplace was the pulse of information. Traders from distant lands shared stories, news of wars, and rumors. Town criers announced edicts. Philosophers debated in public squares. Religious leaders preached messages that shaped public opinion. Planners designed market spaces to foster this informational exchange, balancing openness with control. Some ancient states developed formal postal systems. The Persian Empire's Angarium was a relay system of mounted couriers that moved messages rapidly across vast distances. In China, courier stations were built along roads to refresh horses and riders. Rome used official couriers, called tabellari, for state and military communication. Planning cities with postal routes and stations ensured the flow of information. Not all communication was oral or visual. Ancient cities often housed libraries and archives. The Library of Alexandria, perhaps the most famous, symbolized the pursuit of knowledge. Mesopotamian cities stored vast clay tablet archives. Chinese cities preserved scrolls in dedicated halls. These centers required careful planning for security, preservation, humidity, light, and access. In many ancient cities, education was an organized affair. In Mesopotamia, scribal schools, edubas, trained elites in cuneiform writing and administration, often located near temples or palaces. Athens boasted gymnasiums, doubling as philosophical academies, where Socrates, Plato, and others taught. In China, Confucian academies emerged as key centers of learning, shaping governance and social values. Planners designed these spaces with attention to light, acoustics, and proximity to civic centers, ensuring they were accessible yet contemplative. Theater was a cornerstone of public life. Greek theaters, like the Theater of Dionysus, were architectural marvels designed to amplify voices and create shared experiences. Roman amphitheaters hosted gladiatorial games, chariot races, and spectacles that entertained and reinforced social order. In Mesoamerica, ball courts were not only sporting venues, but ceremonial spaces linked to cosmology. Urban planners carefully situated these venues near population centers and transportation routes, balancing crowd control and spectacle. Craftsmanship thrived within city walls. In medieval Islamic cities, craftspeople clustered into guilds with specialized souks for textiles, metalwork, and ceramics. Ancient Egyptian workshops operated near quarries or temples. Roman cities had designated quarters for potters, blacksmiths, and leatherworkers. Planning these districts required controlling noise, waste, and fire hazards, while fostering community. Cities came alive with festivals. The Panathenaea in Athens celebrated the goddess Athena, with processions, athletic contests, and sacrifices. Rome's numerous festivals combined religious devotion with political theater. In Egypt, temple festivals marked agricultural cycles. Mesoamerican cities held ceremonies tied to calendar cycles and cosmic events. Urban spaces, from plazas to temples, were designed to accommodate large crowds, processions, and temporary structures. Beyond daily life, cities housed repositories of knowledge and art. Alexandria's library aimed to collect all human knowledge. Palaces and temples displayed sculptures, frescoes, and artifacts. Public reading rooms or archives in Mesopotamia preserved legal and historical records. These institutions were carefully integrated into city plans as symbols of prestige and education. Public baths were more than luxury. They were social centers and public health initiatives. In Rome, thermae were grand complexes with heated pools, steam rooms, exercise areas, and gardens designed to promote cleanliness and community. In Islamic cities, hammams combined hygiene with ritual purification, often located near mosques and marketplaces. Ancient Greek gymnasiums included bathing facilities, emphasizing physical and spiritual well-being. Bathhouses required sophisticated engineering, aqueducts, heating systems, hypocausts, drainage, and ventilation, all carefully planned to serve large populations. While modern hospitals are recent, ancient cities had places dedicated to healing. Asclepiae in Greece were healing temples combining medicine, prayer, and rest. In India, Ayurveda clinics existed within cities, often associated with temples or universities. Ancient China had medical halls where herbalists and physicians practiced. Islamic cities featured bimaristans, early hospitals, providing care regardless of status. Planning these institutions required quiet, access to water, and space for patients, treatments, and learning. Sanitation was critical. Poor waste management led to epidemics, threatening entire populations. Ancient cities invested in sewer systems, like Rome's Cloaca Maxima, public latrines with flowing water, regulations on waste disposal and street cleaning, separation of water sources from waste streams. Planners balanced density with ventilation, sunlight, and open spaces to reduce disease. Markets and storage facilities had to ensure food safety. Cities planned granaries with ventilation to prevent mold, regulations on meat and fish sales, access to clean water for washing and cooking, seasonal markets, time to supply fresh produce. Food security was an urban priority linked to political stability. Ancient planners also considered natural hazards, flood control via levees and canals, Mesopotamia, Egypt, earthquake-resistant building techniques, China, Greece, windbreaks and shade trees for urban microclimates, zoning to separate industrial areas from residential quarters. These measures protected health and preserved urban life. Ancient cities were strategically placed along rivers, seas, and overland routes to maximize access to resources and markets. Babylon sat at the crossroads of the Tigris and Euphrates, connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Alexandria leveraged its Mediterranean harbor to become a global center of commerce and culture. Carthage controlled key maritime routes in the western Mediterranean. Chang'an was the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, linking China with Central Asia and beyond. Timbuktu became a vital hub for trans-Saharan trade in gold, salt, and knowledge. Planning for these roles meant cities invested heavily in ports and harbors with warehouses, docks, and customs offices, roads and caravans for overland trade, market districts tailored to foreign merchants and goods, diplomatic quarters for ambassadors and traders. Trade wasn't just about goods, it was about ideas. Ancient cities became melting pots where religions, languages, technologies, and art styles mingled. For example, the spread of alphabetic writing traveled along Mediterranean trade routes from Phoenicia to Greece. Glass-making techniques moved from Mesopotamia to Egypt and later Rome. The compass and paper spread from China westward via Silk Road cities. Religious ideas, from Zoroastrianism to Buddhism, followed merchants and pilgrims. Urban planners had to accommodate this diversity by creating multi-ethnic neighborhoods, providing spaces for foreign worship and customs, designing multilingual signage and official decrees. Cities weren't just markets, they were crossroads of civilization. Cities were also political and military hubs in their regions. Many cities served as capitals of kingdoms, empires, or city-states, fortified outposts guarding trade routes or borders, administrative centers managing taxation and law enforcement. Planning reflected these roles. Fortifications adapted to new military technologies. Palaces and administrative buildings symbolized power. Roads connected cities with rural hinterlands for resource flow. Beyond goods, people flowed through cities. Merchants and artisans moved seeking opportunity. Pilgrims traveled to sacred sites, prompting temporary expansions in urban capacity. Refugees and slaves shaped demographic shifts. Cities planned for this flux with inns and caravanserais, public squares and open spaces for gatherings, markets catering to diverse tastes, sanitation and water infrastructure to handle surges. The networks ancient cities created didn't just shape their own time, they laid foundations for modern urbanism. Trade routes became highways, ports evolved into global hubs, cultural exchanges sparked innovation that echoes today, and planners, ancient and modern, share the challenge of balancing local life with global connections. Cities often followed cycles of growth tied to economic prosperity, political stability, technological innovation, cultural flowering. Examples include Athens during the 5th century BCE, its golden age of democracy, philosophy, and art. Rome at the height of the empire, a sprawling metropolis with millions. Chang'an under the Tang dynasty, a cosmopolitan capital rivaling any city in the world. Tenochtitlan, flourishing as the Aztec capital with advanced infrastructure. Urban planning during these times balanced ambition with functionality, expanding roads, building monumental structures, and improving infrastructure to support booming populations. Many ancient cities faced decline due to war and conquest, environmental degradation, economic shifts, disease outbreaks, political collapse. Some were abandoned, Pompeii frozen in time by volcanic ash, Troy layered with ruins, Great Zimbabwe mysteriously deserted. Others were reborn, Constantinople rising on Byzantium's ashes, Istanbul transforming through empires, Mexico City built over Tenochtitlan's ruins. These transformations involved replanning and reconstruction, adaptation to new cultural or religious norms, shifts in urban function, from political capitals to trade hubs or religious centers. Ancient cities laid groundwork for grid systems used worldwide, infrastructure techniques still foundational today, legal frameworks for property and citizenship, spatial organization of markets, neighborhoods, and public spaces. Modern cities often preserve ancient street layouts, building foundations, or water systems, echoes of the past embedded in the present. Ancient city planning teaches us the importance of integrating function with meaning, balancing public and private spaces, designing for sensory experience, not just utility, planning for resilience amid change, recognizing cities as living, layered organisms. These lessons remain vital as we build for the future. The mastery of building materials was crucial. In Rome, the invention of opus caementitium, Roman concrete, revolutionized construction, enabling massive domes, arches, and aqueducts that have lasted millennia. Egyptians perfected limestone and granite quarrying and transport, creating the pyramids and temples. The Indus Valley standardized baked bricks, enabling uniform and durable construction. In China, rammed earth and timber framing techniques built cities resilient to earthquakes. Planners coordinated quarry sites, transport routes, and skilled labor, ensuring materials arrived on schedule. Aqueducts and canals moved beyond mere utility. The Pont de Gare in France exemplifies precision engineering, with multiple tiers carrying water across valleys. Persian qanats provided sustainable irrigation in arid regions, a technique still used today. Chinese cities developed complex canal systems, including the Grand Canal, linking north and south. The Maya engineered reservoirs and cisterns to capture seasonal rains. These feats required detailed surveying, hydraulic knowledge, and organized labor. From paved Roman roads to Chinese courier stations, transport innovations shaped urban growth. Roads built with layered materials for durability, wheel and axle designs enabling heavier loads, bridges using arches and suspension techniques, early postal relay stations facilitating communication. Transport innovations reduced travel time, expanded trade networks, and integrated hinterlands. Ancient cities devised ways to illuminate streets and maintain safety. Oil lamps and torches placed strategically along main roads, reflective materials, and whitewashed walls to maximize moonlight. Early fire detection methods and organized night watches, planned street widths to accommodate crowds and prevent bottlenecks. Safety planning was vital to prevent disasters and maintain civic order. Beyond sewers, innovations included public latrines with continuous water flow, drainage channels to prevent flooding, waste collection systems and designated dumping sites, recycling organic waste as fertilizer. These systems improved public health and urban livability. Athens wasn't just the cradle of democracy, it was a city planned around the idea of civic participation. The Acropolis crowned the city, visible from afar, symbolizing divine protection. Below, the Agora served as the heartbeat of public life, a carefully designed space for trade, debate, and social interaction. Roads radiated from the Agora, connecting neighborhoods, temples, and theaters. Public buildings, including the Stoa of Atalos, provided shelter and meeting places. The city balanced organic growth with deliberate zoning for residential, commercial, and sacred spaces. Planners incorporated natural topography, building theaters into hillsides and ensuring water access through cisterns and aqueducts. Rome's urban fabric was a masterpiece of engineering and imperial ambition. The grid of the Castra military camps evolved into the city's street layout, with major axes, the Cardo and Decumanus, organizing movement and commerce. Massive infrastructure projects like aqueducts, e.g. Aqua Appia, brought water from distant sources. The Cloaca Maxima sewer system efficiently managed waste. Public amenities like baths, forums, and amphitheaters were distributed across the city, emphasizing social hierarchy and public life. Rome's planning balanced the needs of a sprawling population with imperial propaganda, embedding monuments like the Trajan's Column within the urban grid. Mohenjo-Daro's urban design showcased unprecedented uniformity and sanitation. Streets followed a rectilinear grid, with standardized baked bricks forming homes and public buildings. Each house had access to private wells and toilets connected to covered drains. The Great Bath served ritual and communal functions. City planners prioritized drainage and water management, reflecting a sophisticated civic mindset. The absence of monumental temples or palaces suggests a society valuing functional urbanism and possibly egalitarian principles. Teotihuacan's grand avenues and pyramids reflected a city designed as a cosmic order. The Avenue of the Dead structured the city's layout, connecting major temples aligned with astronomical events. Residential compounds housed diverse ethnic groups, showing social stratification yet urban integration. Markets, workshops, and administrative centers were integrated to support a vibrant economy. Urban planners harmonized ritual significance with practical needs, creating a city both functional and symbolic. Chang'an, under the Tang dynasty, was a planned rectangular city with walls stretching miles. It featured a grid of wide avenues, palace complexes, marketplaces, and residential wards. The city was a hub of the Silk Road, bustling with merchants, diplomats, and artisans from across Eurasia. Urban planning emphasized symmetry, cosmological order, and efficient governance. Public spaces, temples, and parks were integrated, reflecting Confucian ideals and imperial authority. Modern city planning owes much to ancient innovations. The grid layout, perfected by Greeks and Romans, still guides cities worldwide, from Manhattan to Melbourne. Zoning principles, balancing residential, commercial, and civic uses, trace routes to ancient districts and guild quarters. Infrastructure feats, like aqueducts and sewers, set standards for modern water management. Public spaces, agoras, forums, plazas, inform today's parks, squares, and pedestrian zones. Urban planning remains a blend of art, science, and politics, much as it was in ancient times. Many challenges persist: balancing density with livability, managing infrastructure in growing populations, preserving heritage while enabling development, ensuring equitable access to resources and space, integrating diverse communities. Ancient planners grappled with these too, offering lessons in resilience and adaptability. Ancient cities were dynamic, evolving entities, layered in space and time. Modern planners increasingly embrace this view, recognizing cities as multi-layered palimpsests, spaces of continual negotiation, arenas of cultural expression and conflict, ecosystems of human and environmental interaction. Understanding ancient urbanism deepens appreciation of our own city's complexities. From the cosmic alignments of Angkor to the social forums of Athens, ancient cities remind us that good planning integrates practical needs, cultural meanings, environmental realities, social justice. As we face 21st century urban challenges, climate change, migration, technological shifts, drawing wisdom from the past can guide innovative, humane city-making. Many ancient cities thrived because of advanced water systems that balanced human use with environmental limits. The Persian Qanat system sustainably tapped underground aquifers without overuse. Angkor's vast reservoirs regulated monsoon floods, maintaining agriculture despite climate variability. Roman aqueducts distributed water efficiently, supporting dense populations without depleting sources. These systems reflected long-term thinking, integrating urban needs with natural cycles. Cities often integrated food production within or near their boundaries. Terraced fields near Machu Picchu supplied residents in challenging terrain. Community gardens and orchards in ancient Mediterranean cities contributed to local diets. Floodplain agriculture supported Mesopotamian urban centers. Planning for food proximity reduced vulnerability and supported resilience. Ancient builders selected materials and designs suited to their climates. Thick mudbrick walls in Mesopotamia insulated against heat and cold. High ceilings and courtyards in Islamic cities promoted airflow. Earthquake-resistant construction techniques in Greece and China enhanced safety. Such adaptations reduced energy needs and increased comfort. Cities planned social cohesion and adaptability. Mixed-use neighborhoods encouraged diverse interactions. Public forums and gathering places fostered civic engagement. Neighborhood boundaries balanced privacy with community. Social infrastructure proved as vital as physical. Ancient urbanism teaches that sustainability isn't just technology, but integration with environment, with society, with culture. Ancient planners modeled holistic approaches that can inspire modern sustainable city design. Ancient cities teach us that good planning balances functionality with meaning, individual needs with community welfare, stability with adaptability, nature with construction. These principles remain relevant as urban populations swell and climate challenges intensify. Every street, wall, and plaza is a chapter in a city's ongoing story. Ancient planners knew their work would ripple through generations. Modern urbanism must honor this legacy, preserving heritage while embracing innovation. Cities have always been diverse and dynamic. Planning must respect cultural differences, social equity, and ecological limits. Ancient examples remind us, inclusion strengthens cities. Ultimately, cities are for people. Planning is as much about human experience as infrastructure. Spaces that inspire, comfort, and connect create thriving communities. As we build the cities of tomorrow, let's carry forward the wisdom of the past. By blending ancient insights with modern technology, we can create urban environments that sustain, uplift, and endure. While we touched on Roman roads and aqueducts, consider the labor, politics, and innovation behind these feats. Roman roads weren't built overnight. They involved surveying teams using tools like the groma for right angles and the chorobates for leveling. These instruments reflected an early blend of geometry and practical engineering. The roads also represented Roman imperial will, securing borders and enabling rapid troop movement, crucial in both conquest and defense. Aqueduct construction demanded not just hydraulic expertise, but social coordination. Workers organized in guilds, supplies coordinated over long distances, and funding allocated often through imperial patronage. Maintenance was a never-ending task, keeping channels clear of silt, repairing leaks, and protecting water quality. In China, the Grand Canal connected northern and southern economic centers, allowing grain to move efficiently. Its construction spanned centuries and required huge labor forces, organized under imperial control. This infrastructure shaped the political geography of the empire, enabling economic integration and military mobility. Beyond mere trade, markets were places where cultural identities merged and transformed. For example, the bustling markets of Alexandria attracted Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Romans, and later Arabs, each bringing languages, customs, and goods. The planners of Alexandria had to accommodate diverse populations by zoning different quarters, creating places of worship, and regulating commerce to avoid conflict. Similarly, the Silk Road bazaars, such as those in Samarkand, were vibrant centers of exchange, not only of silk and spices, but of art, technology, and religion. Urban layouts reflected this diversity, with multi-ethnic quarters, caravanserais, and diplomatic spaces. Ancient cities often displayed stark contrasts in wealth and status through their urban form. In Rome, the grandeur of the Palatine Hill contrasted with the crowded insulae where the working classes lived. Wealthy estates often had direct access to aqueduct-fed fountains and baths, while the poor relied on public facilities. In medieval Islamic cities, the urban fabric included citadels for rulers, residential quarters for merchants, and poorer neighborhoods with narrow, winding alleys. This physical separation reinforced social hierarchies, but also created unique neighborhood identities. Planning decisions about street width, building height, and access to amenities reflected and perpetuated social divisions. Cities were full sensory environments. Beyond the planned scent zones, many ancient cities integrated music and performance into urban life. In Athens, open-air theaters doubled as forums for civic ritual. The acoustics were engineered so voices carried clearly, reinforcing community bonds. In Egyptian temple complexes, ritual sounds, chanting, bells, percussion were essential. City layouts ensured these sounds reached the populace while remaining within sacred boundaries. The tactility of surfaces, from polished marble in palaces to rough mud brick in commoner homes, also communicated status and function. The spatial organization reflecting gender was complex. In many cities, public baths or fountains were gender segregated. Streets sometimes had male and female times or zones. Homes were designed with gendered divisions, not only for privacy, but for social control, often reflecting broader patriarchal structures. Understanding these spatial dynamics offers insights into daily life, social order, and power relations in ancient urban settings. Ancient cities were theaters of continuous ritual. Festivals punctuated the calendar and reshaped urban spaces temporarily and symbolically. In Athens, the Panathenaia festival transformed the city with processions from the Dipylon Gate to the Acropolis, weaving through streets specially designed to accommodate throngs of participants and spectators. Temporary structures like altars and viewing stands appeared, while shops closed to clear paths. Rome's religious calendar was packed with public ceremonies, sacrifices, games, triumphs, held in the Forum, Circus Maximus, and temples. Roads were sometimes closed or reconfigured. Planners accounted for these events in the design of broad avenues and plazas. In Mesoamerican cities like Tenochtitlan, festivals often involved mass gatherings at temples and plazas, with elaborate processions, human sacrifices, and market fairs, requiring extensive planning for crowd control, ritual logistics, and provisioning. Such events temporarily redefined urban space, underscoring the city's social and cosmic order. While markets were central, urban economies were multifaceted. Craft production clusters were planned near raw material sources or transport hubs, but also deliberately separated from residential areas to minimize pollution and risk. Trade guilds or merchant associations often managed their own quarters, regulated quality, and maintained social welfare, influencing the city's zoning and architecture. Tax collection points, toll houses, and minting facilities required secure, accessible locations. Infrastructure investments like warehouses, docks, and roads were political decisions reflecting economic priorities. Planning a city's economy meant balancing diversity of production, flow of goods, and social stability. The architecture of power was carefully orchestrated. Councils met in dedicated buildings like the Roman Curia or Athenian Bouleuterion, designed for visibility and acoustics that supported debate and governance. Administrative complexes combined functions, offices, archives, courts, often clustered near temples to link divine and temporal authority. Monumental architecture expressed legitimacy. Palaces, triumphal arches, and statues visually reinforcing rulers' presence. Urban layout often physically separated elites from commoners through gated districts, elevated platforms, or restricted access zones. The city itself became a map of power relations. Ancient cities housed varied educational institutions, from elite academies to vocational schools. Athens hosted philosophical schools like Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, often located near public spaces to facilitate discourse. In Mesopotamia, scribal schools, idubas, trained administrators and priests in cuneiform, housed within temple complexes. Alexandria's library was a monumental center of scholarship, gathering texts from across the known world, fostering translation and original research. In China, Confucian academies influenced bureaucratic training and moral education, integrated within urban precincts. Urban planners had to ensure these centers were accessible, well-lit, quiet, yet connected to civic life. Beyond teaching, ancient cities valued record-keeping. Archives maintained legal, economic, and religious documents, often stored in dedicated buildings with controlled environments. The Library of Alexandria symbolized the zenith of knowledge preservation, designed to support scholars, translators, and collectors. In Rome, the establishment of public libraries reflected imperial patronage and the democratization of knowledge. These institutions required planning for durability, security, and accessibility. Cities fostered craftsmanship and scientific inquiry in specialized workshops. Artisans and inventors worked in urban quarters dedicated to metallurgy, textiles, or ceramics. In Islamic cities, scholars translated and expanded upon Greek, Indian, and Persian sciences, often centered in madrasas and observatories. Planning these spaces balanced the needs for light, ventilation, safety, and collaboration. Innovation thrived where knowledge, craft, and commerce intersected. Public discourse was a key urban feature. Agora and forums served as venues for rhetoric, philosophy, and political debate. Street corner orators, poets, and philosophers contributed to a vibrant intellectual street life. Festivals and religious events incorporated educational elements. Such cultural practices shaped city design, emphasizing gathering spaces, acoustics, and visibility. Ancient cities were shaped by their environment. Mesopotamian cities, built with thick mud-brick walls to insulate against harsh heat and cold desert nights. Egyptian urban layouts reflected proximity to the Nile, with elevated structures to avoid floods. Andean cities like Machu Picchu used terracing and water channels to adapt to mountainous terrain. Chinese cities incorporated feng shui principles, aligning buildings with natural features to promote harmony. Planners leveraged local materials and knowledge to create livable spaces suited to climate. Flooding was both a blessing and a threat. The Nile's predictable floods supported agriculture, but demanded raised foundations and canals. In Mesopotamia, complex irrigation systems regulated unpredictable river flows. Urban drainage systems directed rainwater away from living spaces. Water management required foresight and continual maintenance. Plants and water features improved microclimates. Gardens, courtyards, and parks offered shade and cooling. Trees and fountains helped reduce dust and heat. Urban planting was sometimes designed to buffer winds or channel breezes. Planners understood that natural elements contributed to public health. Some cities showed early planning for disasters. Earthquake-resistant construction techniques in regions like Greece and China. Defensive walls also protected against floods and wild animals. Emergency access routes and assembly points were integrated. Ancient planners combined practical engineering with risk mitigation. Though hospitals as we know them were rare, many cities had healing centers. Greek Asclepiae combined temples with therapeutic treatments and healing rituals. Indian Ayurvedic clinics were integrated with urban religious centers. Chinese cities housed medical schools and herbal dispensaries. Islamic Bimaristans offered care to all, often funded by charitable endowments. Physicians, herbalists, and surgeons practiced within these spaces, contributing to urban health. Clean water and waste removal were vital. Extensive sewer systems, like Rome's Cloaca Maxima, improved sanitation. Public baths promoted cleanliness and social cohesion. Regulations governed waste disposal, street cleaning, and market hygiene. Effective sanitation reduced disease and enhanced livability. Cities faced outbreaks of plague, cholera, and other diseases. Ancient responses included quarantine zones and isolation practices, ritual purification and health regulations, urban planning that favored airflow and sunlight to reduce contagion. Though limited by knowledge, many cities sought to contain and prevent disease spread. Ensuring food quality was a priority. Markets were regulated to prevent spoilage. Granaries stored surplus grain safely. Urban planners designed marketplaces and storage with ventilation and access to water. Good nutrition underpinned population health and urban stability. As we've journeyed through the stones and stories of ancient cities, one truth stands clear. Cities are more than collections of buildings and streets. They are living tapestries woven from human ambition, ingenuity, belief, and resilience. From the earliest walls to grand temples, bustling markets to quiet gardens, ancient urban planners crafted spaces that balance the practical with the profound. Their legacy endures, not only beneath our feet in ruins and roadways, but in the very ideas that shape how we build and live today. In understanding their triumphs and challenges, we find inspiration and guidance, because the art of city building is, at its heart, the art of building community, and that is a timeless endeavor. Thank you for exploring with me the ancient roots of our urban world. May this knowledge help us shape cities that endure, inspire, and nurture for generations to come.